Hello, I'm Enzo, and how hard is it to beat Nomifactory? This is a widely requested mod pack from my comments, so you know I had to try it. Nomifactory, Fakutori Nomi, there's actually Japanese in the logo and description. I'm not sure why, but I can read it and I like it. Anyways, this pack is based off of Omnifactory. You can kind of tell by the name, and these packs are centered around Gregtech, specifically Community Edition and Shadows of Gregtech, so it's way different from Gregtech New Horizons that I'm used to. And of course, this pack includes all the insanity that those mods bring. What makes this so unique is the fact that Nomifactory and Omnifactory, I guess, are focused around automation and factory building, stuff like that, instead of all the other grinding and magic stuff that I absolutely hate in Gregtech New Horizons. The best part is that this pack is actually designed to be played on peaceful difficulty, so I don't have to deal with any mobs, which is absolutely awesome. The only thing that disappoints me a bit by reading the description is the fact they actually skip the Steam age. This is so that you can get into more automation and machinery faster, obviously, but the Steam age is probably my favorite part of Gregtech. But I am insanely curious to see how this pack works. Another major difference is that the primary world that you'll be playing in, you can do like a standard Minecraft world, but it recommends the Lost Cities dimension, which is fascinating. The Lost Cities, I've actually played with several times now that I understand this mod, is filled with all sorts of buildings that are from obviously an ancient civilization, but modern by our standards, I guess. You kind of get the point. These buildings have tons of loot in them, and a lot of mob spawners, but we're playing in peaceful. The loot is the big key there. You can get all sorts of crazy resources that can launch your progression super far ahead if you get them early on. On top of that, for the first time in I don't know how many 7, 8, 9 plus years, I've actually decided to spawn in a starter chest. It doesn't really help, it's just a bunch of wooden tools and some wood logs and saplings, but still, it gives me the nice nostalgia boost from the early days of playing Minecraft. I also forgot relatively early on that food is not going to be necessary here because, well, we're playing on peaceful. In Gregtech New Horizons, you do still need food in peaceful mode, but thankfully this is more standard Minecraft. I spent a while getting all sorts of good loot and stuff like furnaces, crafting tables, anvils from the various buildings. I decided to start mining, and this is where things get really unique. The game actually starts you out with a scanner, which lets you find ores way easier, and a diamond hammer. It's called a mining hammer. Essentially, it's like a Tinker's Construct hammer where it mines a 3x3 area for you, which is pretty awesome. Gregtech Community Edition works a little bit like New Horizons, which I should remind you all is my only other Gregtech experience to this point. I'll explain that a bit more later on. But essentially, the ores in this pack are generated in massive chunks, and similar ores will be in those chunks. You can look at it in the JEI menu, whatever. In New Horizons, the ores are pretty awesome and they generate in specific chunks in a grid, so it's really easy to go ahead and find the next ore chunk. On top of that, there's like a menu in the minimap, or an overlay I guess, where you can actually see what ore types are in there once you've discovered it. It's incredibly nice. Unfortunately in here, there's no minimap overlay, which I really miss at this point, and all of the ore chunks, well, don't exist. The ore, I say chunks, but not like Minecraft chunks. The ore veins, that's the word I was looking for, can actually spawn like together in this pack, and that's really annoying when you're trying to mine one specific resource and your inventory gets clogged up with junk from another one. So early on, I was going around looking for iron and coal. These are going to be two key resources, as well as like copper, tin, all that other good stuff. Unfortunately, I didn't find a good iron vein. I found a gold and vanadium magnetite vein, which magnetite can be smelted right into iron. Vanadium I will probably save for later on, it will be useful. But I just didn't get a good iron vein specifically early on. I will find one eventually with my scanner, but the Early game, especially right now, just mining ores is going to be very slow and painful. I started refining more of my resources into things I can actually use when I discover a mod I've never seen before, called Hooked. This is exactly what it looks like, by the way, grappling hooks. Now, I've always loved games like Just Cause, and this lets me fill my Just Cause fantasy perfectly by allowing me to have a grappling hook. There are actually several varieties, but I only ever use the iron and diamond ones. I definitely should have tried redstone and ender, but still, these are insanely fun. With a specific keybind, I eventually changed it to tab for easy use. Yeah, I can kind of just grapple my way around the world. This is awesome because it allows me to do even more than you would think. I need to get some extra stuff later on, but it'll be really awesome. I'm going to move around like crazy. Speaking of crazy, there's so many things that I kind of skipped over early on here. First of all, furnaces. Yes. Since this isn't as hardcore as Gregtech New Horizons, we have access to early variants of like iron furnaces that I can upgrade into copper, silver, gold, diamond, and eventually obsidian. These all give like more smelting slots and faster cook times, which is very awesome. Another game changer I got early on that I haven't shown is actually my dark steel boots. I haven't found any other dark steel armor in the cities, but these boots have jump boost, which does require power, which means it's gonna run out pretty soon. But once I get power, I get like 2 blocks of jump. It's pretty nice. And I think it's flippers. It allows me to move way faster in water. It's like Depth Strider, but on steroids. It's pretty awesome. Anyways, after that, I actually had to go and craft all the Gregtech tools. It has been several hundreds of hours since I had to do this. It's kind of jarring, actually. I'm like, man, how do I make all of these? I'm not used to this. I have machines to do this for me. So I have to go through all of the crafting all over again. Getting wrought iron isn't crazy difficult like it is in New Horizons. Thankfully, you can just put iron back into a furnace instead of having to deal with the whole like nugget shenanigans, but I'm pretty sure they changed wrought iron in 2.9 or something like that. Whatever, I have it, it's easy to make, and this is what's going to be creating all of my tools for a while. While I went exploring, I found some insane stuff, like this. I'm not sure why this room spawns or what mod it's from, but it is full of goodies. I mean, entire blocks of iron, diamond, and gold, which thankfully can be converted right into ingots. This isn't hardcore Gregtech, and some chests that are pretty decent. But I remember now, the main thing I was actually looking for is tin. Here's the hilarious part, right? There is a vein of spodumene, salt, and that like light pink lithium containing stuff, salt vein, let's just call it that. It's actually underneath my base and it has trace amounts of tin ore in it, which would have been nice to know because early on you are going to need thousands, okay, probably not that much, but definitely hundreds of iron, bronze, copper, tin, silver, gold. All of these basic resources are used in like everything at this point, so I'm going to need a lot of them. That's why I wanted to mark down all of my locations for mining this stuff early on. Another fascinating resource that I'm going to need throughout the entire run is actually rubber. There are a bunch of different ways to get rubber. Thankfully, you can either buy rubber trees for super cheap with the Nomi coins, or just find them around the map. I basically grew a huge field of these things outside my base, and that iron axe that you see in my inventory is actually called a lumber axe. It cuts down entire trees, kind of like vein miner, but it does work on all wood products, so you can accidentally break like hundreds of chests if you're not careful. Anyways, making rubber is easy enough, and it'll become super cheap with machines later on. You can also turn it into plant balls, which can be turned into slime balls for early game slime if you need it. Very neat little system. Alright, now that I have all sorts of resources, it's time to get serious and actually making some machinery. Nomifactory has a very unique combination of tech mods, so even though we have Gregtech, we have stuff like thermal expansion, Ender.io, which is also in Gregtech New Horizons. So there's going to be some interesting stuff going on here. First of all, I need to make red alloy and conductive iron. Unfortunately, to make all of these things, I actually have to crush down the dust, like iron into iron dust and copper into copper dust, and then combine those with redstone to make their respective products. Red alloy, conductive iron, you get the point. And unfortunately, since I don't have any machines yet, I have to re-experience the pain of Gregtech, where I have to make plates out of like 2 ingots into a plate. It's absolutely horrible. But of course, once I start to get some Gregtech machines, which is super easy thanks to this pack, making all sorts of metal and other products will be far cheaper than before. Also, you're going to see me hopping into LAN mode a lot in this playthrough. That's so that I can enable cheats in the inventory. Essentially, a lot of missions in here require you to collect a certain amount of resources, like plates in this example, before it actually completes the mission. There's no way to skip stuff like this. And even as you can see, I was missing copper dust because I didn't have that fully in my inventory. It's insanely annoying. So this is just going to happen purely to complete quests. The first thing I'm going to make is a steam dynamo. This is the most basic power I can possibly get, as well as an infinite water source. These are relatively cheap, requiring 2 buckets of water and some wrought iron plates. I say relatively cheap, but of course that's a lot of effort. The generator itself was a combination of all the stuff I just made. Iron to make a furnace, wrought iron for the gears, gold to actually make some gold rods so that I can make the conductive thingy, whatever that's called, and red alloy parts to make the top of the dynamo. It's not difficult, and we're going to see all of these resources used a ton throughout the early game. So this is where the playthrough really starts to get interesting, not only because I can make new machines, but also because of the mechanics unique to this pack. You see, in Omni and Nomifactory here, things don't work like normal. You see, like I said, I'm used to Gregtech New Horizons, which is kind of like the hardcore Gregtech. This is what I call Gregtech Light, in a way, where there's still a lot of complexity, but it's nowhere near as bad as New Horizons. And this first mechanic that we'll learn is actually power conversion. You see, in New Horizons, you're 99% of the time working with Gregtech EU, energy units. However, in here, you're mostly going to be working with RF. Redstone flux, that's like the standard power unit for all of Minecraft mods, really. So, in New Horizons, you can only convert EU to RF. This is used very rarely for some Ender.io and Galacticraft machines, but in here, there's actually unique buildings that allow you to do the opposite, converting RF into EU. In case you're curious, 4 RF is 1 EU. This number is going to be insanely important as we get into like the late tiers of power where you need like hundreds of thousands of RF to get enough EU for your machines. It's going to be crazy, but that's to worry about later. All you need to know for now is 4 RF. 4 RF is 1 EU, 1 EU, 4 RF. Makes sense. After collecting some resources, you're probably wondering why I'm doing this. Alright, to skip a very long story, I had to make SNAD, which is available in this pack, but it requires like double compressed sand. It took several stacks of sand to make this stuff, but it's worth it. When you use a redstone clock, or an observer clock like I did here, it actually teaches you how to make a redstone clock from one of the other mods, but whatever. This lets me grow sugarcane insanely fast, which is pretty important. I need sugarcane to make paper. Why do I need paper? Well, I want circuits, because I want to actually start making machinery to use the power I just created. The first circuits that you're going to be making, very much like New Horizons, are very expensive and primal, to say the least. My boards are made of resin and wood. Yeah, pretty simple. I'm making diodes the very expensive way using copper wire. This is also what I needed the paper for, and some coal or charcoal dust. This is a bit ridiculous, and it's extremely painful to make all of this stuff with my tools. Thankfully, I'm just about to get machines though, and that's what I really need, because once you get even your first basic couple of machines, like the wire mill, that's standard, and in here the compressor is used to actually make plates instead of like bending machines in New Horizons. And yeah, this is how we're going to make our basic circuits with these really stupid, cheap primal components. The vacuum tubes also require a lot of paper and copper, not to mention glass. I'll keep saying it, this process is so painful early on, but thankfully it won't be too long before we get, well, easier circuits at the very least. And yeah, this is early game for you. It's just going to be a giant mixture of all of this, well, 99% iron and copper, a little bit of redstone. So I'm going to have to go mining for a lot of these components very often. Anyways, once I get some primal circuits, this puts me well on my way to start making my first machines. But the fun thing, before I can start even making a single machine, I have to make a unique block called the CEF. This is the machine that converts RF into EU. The opposite is called the CEU, which I know they sound very confusing and I've gotten them mixed up several times throughout this run, but you don't need to worry about that too much. The CEF is what will allow me to start powering my machines. These come in two variants, 4 and 16 storage cells. That is basically how many batteries I can throw in there. And if you have no batteries, it has a tiny power capacity, but with more batteries, you can obviously store more power. However, you need 1 battery per amp that you want to use. And extreme fun fact that's going to be very important later on, you actually need the proper amount of amperage that the machine can output. So 4 or 16 times wires based on, well, your machine. Because for some reason in this pack, it's always trying to output kind of like a standard power system, unlike, normal Gregtech, where you can technically put way more machines on a low amp wire. You just have to be careful, like what machines are active when. No, and here you have to have 4 times wire or else the wire will just disappear. Thankfully, in this pack, machines don't catch on fire, explode, or kill you in any other way like New Horizons does, which is very nice. They're also not vulnerable to rain or other natural things like New Horizons, so you're way more free to do stuff in this pack. But alright, now I've finally gotten the quest where I can actually start working towards that wire mill that I desperately want. But as we all know, I had to go on a massive mining trip to get all of the resources I needed. It was mostly a lot of redstone, as you can see in my chest there. I need redstone both to make some more red alloy, conductive iron, and to magnetize the iron bars, or rods in this case, that I need to actually make the motors. Yes, you gotta make a bunch of motors which require wires. It's just horrible. I cannot understate how painful early game Gregtech is. But thankfully, with all of that finally completed, I have my absolute first machine, the wire mill. This is gonna take wires from having to make plates, which requires 2 ingots, and then cutting the wires themselves to finally just 1 ingot creates, well, 2 wires generally, and then I can throw those wires in again to actually make fine wires, which aren't useful sometimes, but copper, for example, can make a lot of recipes really cheap. Like, those motors can actually be made with fine copper wire instead of normal, which makes it, I think, like 2 to 4 times cheaper. I can't remember exactly. Whatever, I have this amazing capability now, finally. The wire mill is a massive help to make things cheaper, but there's still several other machines I have my eyes on because they're gonna make everything else cheaper. The compressor. Now, instead of 2 plates creating 1 ingot, I have the perfect 1 ingot to plate ratio that I want. That's very nice. Unfortunately, the main problem with this whole system is that, well, I can only really power 1 machine at a time because of my storage, and, well, pretty soon I'm gonna have to micro my machines and turn them off so that I don't use up too much power. Obviously, a smart person would just create more power generation, but you know me. Anyways, the other machines I have my eyes set on are a lathe, which will let me produce rods for cheap as well. It's generally 1 ingot to 2 rods, which is perfect, and all sorts of materials can be turned into rods. It also has some other uses later on, and I'm talking like end game stuff here. The lathe can actually be used to combine multiple rods to make a long rod. This is normally done in the forge hammer, but as you can tell, things aren't done normally here. Another key machine, especially early on, is going to be the alloy smelter, for obvious reason. A lot of the resources I've used so far are combinations of iron and redstone or copper, and this is going to help make those ingots way cheaper, which is very nice. Still have that power issue though. I made a macerator to pulverize ore down so that I can get more stuff out of it. Unfortunately, I won't unlock extra products. I think that's till like HV or something. I've got a centrifuge and electrolyzer to get other stuff out of ores if I need it. I spent a long while exploring, looking for all sorts of new ores, and I finally found a lapis vein. Only to quickly remember that I can't really use lapis for fortune, which was my original idea, because, well, Gregtech ores. Thankfully, lapis will be required way later on. Anyways, I gathered all sorts of stuff and, of course, marked down plenty of ore veins from that trip. Most important of all, I happened to get a bunch of lithium from that salt vein, and I used it to make a bunch of lithium batteries so I can start storing more power. I also forgot to mention that I actually made a couple of extra generators, and with the technology I have now, I was able to make some augments for them that lets me generate more power from fuel and convert the whole system to a steam turbine. So 1 turbine powers 2 steam generators now, and I get like 4 times more power in total or something like that. Whatever, it's a way better system than before. One of the most unique things I've found about this pack is, well, all of the people that have worked on it are clearly psychopaths for allowing this mod to exist. Yeah. You see how vines are kind of spreading everywhere in the world, and then between buildings? Yeah, that's apparently a mod. Vines just infinitely grow and spread once they've reached the bottom of something. Like I said, psychopath. This is getting insanely annoying to deal with, let me tell you. And unfortunately, you have to deal with the problem from top down, so it takes a while to deal with these stupid things. I've also been working on making some other machines, including a fluid extractor and fluid solidifier. These actually require fluid pumps, which are super interesting to make. They're just like normal Gregtech. You know, I need a bunch of tools, tin rotor, tin screws, which are really annoying to make all of those, but I can actually use paper to make rings in this version, which is fascinating. Only for LV though, but still, very neat recipe. These machines will have all sorts of uses later on, but for now, they are very helpful for making stuff like gears and rotors, because those recipes suck otherwise. Besides that, I've actually had an alloy smelter running for quite a while now. I've been creating, my conductive iron and red alloy, but I've also been stockpiling nickel, and I've been making a ton of steel, because obviously steel is going to be super important later on. Thankfully, it's not required for LV machines like it is in New Horizons, but wrought iron is, that's way easier though. As always though, I've been working on all sorts of projects, including this fascinating one, making ender pearls. To get ender pearls early on, you have to use diamonds, which is a bit expensive, and pulsating dust. So how do I make pulsating dust? It's actually pretty simple. You can get it from an ore called uranite, which, if you know from New Horizons, you can only get on like Mars and other high-tier planets like that. But no, in here you can actually find it just underground in veins. It's also got some other radioactive stuff like uranium-238 and pitchblende. I think that's the name. Unfortunately, pitchblende has to be electrolyzed, and I don't think I can do that until MV. There's a lot of stuff you can't electrolyze until MV in this pack, go figure. I've also been processing stuff like sphalerite and zinc to get gallium. Gallium, of course, is used to make all sorts of circuits. And let's just say I might have accidentally made a little bit too much, because I kid you not, I made 2 stacks of diodes when they are literally used for one recipe, nothing else. Other diodes are used for recipes later on, but these are, useless, especially considering once I make these primitive processors, which are my first tier 2 or MV circuits, it becomes useless, because 2 of these lets me make an LV assembler, which is essentially like a circuit assembler as well, just like in New Horizons. But this is how I make pure assemblers in this pack, and this will let me make circuits and everything else way easier and cheaper. Next up, both to explore, get some more resources, and potentially good loot, I wanted to check out what is in the Nether. So guess what? In this pack, unfortunately, you can't just go to the Nether with a portal. Funnily enough, you can do that in Gregtech, but of course you require the complicated steel, flint and steel. But no, in here you literally cannot build a portal. It requires another fancy way to get to the Nether, because of course it does. So my route to the Nether is naturally going to be a Nether cake, and unfortunately this bars the Nether for a very long time, because making this cake is insanely difficult. And the netherrack isn't even the worst part. That'll be interesting to get, certainly, but no, it's the soul sand that's the real killer here. Netherrack can be made in a chemical reactor with dust and lava, so that's simple. The cake base is just standard cake stuff, but soul sand is going to require one of 2 routes. I either have to make an atomic reconstructor, or go down deep mob learning and get nether mobs. Both of these routes absolutely suck, so I'm going to put that project off for a long time. So I decided to go exploring a bit more, and I found all sorts of fascinating things. Pig spawners, which are just glitched mob spawners, this is what they actually default to, which I found pretty funny. Some applied Engergistics meteors, and bauxite ore, which also happen to have immolite, which contains rudolite. Both of these are used to make titanium. So that's good to know. I've got titanium in my world, and it's relatively easy to access. As a matter of fact, a lot of the ores that you find in normal Gregtech, usually in other planets and rare places, like the End, are actually in the overworld. I think it's later on, but I have a clip of me finding platinum ore, like a whole vein of it, like deep down in a mine shaft. Unfortunately, it was a super tiny vein. Larger veins are found in the End, though. Since I was planning to head to the Nether, I decided to make a bunch of little buildings here. I've got some ender tanks, which require fluid pumps, blaze rods, which I actually can only get from looting the city and collecting brewing stands, which you can thankfully just craft into blaze rods, a magmatic dynamo, which requires all sorts of electric components I already have, an ender pump, which also requires ender pearl blocks like the tanks. So it's a bit expensive, but definitely worth it. You see, I wanted to pump up some magma so that I can actually use it as a fuel source. It's not insanely good, but it's a little bit better than the steam that I have for now. And I wanted to use this for a little while instead. Or in addition, I guess. At this point, I'm pretty much doing one of 2 things: gathering resources or processing them. One of the quests the game wants you to do is making glowstone. This requires phosphorus, which you have to get from apatite veins. There's actually one nearby where I currently am, but I had a way better idea. Instead of spending phosphorus and gold dust, which are both really annoying to get right now, why not just mine the glowstone straight up? It spawns very rarely in tunnels underneath the lost cities, but I'd say that's infinitely easier than having to make it, at least for now. But I won't be able to actually use that for a little bit to make what I want. For now, I'm actually working on something really interesting. Now that I have Invar and electrical steel, which is steel and silicone, I can actually start making upgrades to my thermodynamics machines. This is going to be the reinforced tier that I'm working on here. These upgrades are very expensive though, because it requires a ton of invar and electrical steel. But these upgrades are well worth it because it heavily increases the okay, well, it depends on the machine, but in this case, the power generation of these machines, which is quite important considering it's my only power. Of course, I could always, build more of these and expand my power gen, but I didn't do that. Now that I have all the resources for it, I decided to finally make myself an electric blast furnace. Of course, if you've played Gregtech New Horizons, or I guess any other Gregtech pack, you'll know that this is an integral part of the whole thing. There are going to be a ton of recipes I'm going to have to use that require the blast furnace. Unfortunately, as you may know, these are quite expensive and difficult to build. It requires a ton of invar, which is iron and nickel. That is to make all of the top and bottom casings, and then a ton of cupronickel, which is copper and nickel, to make the coils for it. Of course, the coils are going to get way more annoying and expensive as we go on. Not to mention the fact I literally can't make the next tier of coils for a very long time. It's really weird, trust me, but we'll get to that eventually. The electric blast furnace allows me to start processing materials like aluminum, which lets me start making MV machines. I built a little transformer instead of working with the CEF for MV. This is just because I have a massive battery storage bank right there. I think I have 16 batteries with LV, so I might as well use what I have currently. I decided to make an electrolyzer so that I can start breaking down more materials, because you're only limited to clay in LV. I think that's literally it. So I'd like to start processing more stuff and getting, well, more things out of my electrolyzer. Besides that, I can start making some other very good things in the electric blast furnace, like vibrant alloy, which is going to be necessary later on. Vibrant alloy requires energetic blend, which is a mixture of redstone and glowstone. That's why I needed it earlier. The energetic blend is combined with gold to make energetic alloy. Energetic alloy can be combined with ender pearls to make vibrant alloy for other stuff later on. I was processing stuff for a while and I decided to go mining. Now, you'll probably notice a couple of things here. I did make this flux bore legitimately. I've got a capacitor that has a ton of power stored, which also powers my boots. However, I may have been messing around with some enchantments and commands for a bit, and I decided to, well, cheat pretty much by enchanting my tool so that I could go ahead and mine faster. Even though it is cheating, I think this is perfectly fine, because all it really does is save me, and you guys, a ton of time. This is just brain off mining. I know you are supposed to automate resources, and I will be doing a lot of that automation later on, but for now, I just want raw ores. As a matter of fact, I prefer mining ores to a lot of other automation in packs. I think it's just more fun and makes more sense. But yeah, this is what I'm going to be doing for a while. Now that I have more resources, I've started to set up MV. Now here's a big thing I didn't realize until later, somehow. You don't actually need a battery buffer after the CEF. The CEF does act as one as long as you have batteries inside of it. So yeah, I wasted a bunch of resources there, but it's fine. Anyways, I'm currently working on actually setting up MV because, well, I want higher tier machines. And my entire plan for the MV age is going to be magma power. It's a great idea at first. It doesn't work as well as I thought later on. That's partially a failure of the pump mod, because that thing is just absolute garbage, I have to say. But oh well, it is what it is. I'll have to deal with it for a while until I figure out better power, like way later on. I also have Electrum, which is a combination of silver and gold, and since I have aluminum, I can actually make the next tier of upgrade for my dynamos. This is pretty nice because it gives them even more power generation, and that's kind of necessary when we're working with MV here. On top of that, with all of the other resources I can make, I can actually start making these augments which allow me to produce even more power. Unfortunately, one of the materials it requires is called sterling silver. It's not difficult to make, it's just silver and copper dust, but it takes a painfully long time to smelt in the blast furnace. So that's the main bottleneck of making these things. These augments allow me to generate more power in my generators at the cost, or not really fuel efficiency, it just uses up fuel faster. The alternative is to build more generators and use an augment that gives you a bit more fuel efficiency, so you get more power for your fuel. There's a trade-off either way. I also learned that even though I'm playing in peaceful mode, I am not invincible. Yeah, so apparently exposed wires can kill you. Go figure. You also just have to crouch on your grave to get all of your loot back. This mod is very handy, but yeah, I guess I now know I can't touch those wires anymore. That's like one of my favorite things. I had a similar thing like this happen in Gregtech New Horizons where like the hot steam pipes would damage me, but that's one of my favorite things is just running around on top of my factory buildings. And this ruins that fun for me. Also, I assure you this is going to be a running trend. I'll have to go and check my total deaths at the end, but I swear it's gotta be at least 30 plus to, yes, literally running into live wires all around my base. Now that I'm getting into a slightly more advanced tier, instead of being able to just make batteries out of like red alloy and I think it was tin, of course I still can fill them with the same materials, but I need lead and antimony. That's why I have the electrolyzer and ore washer, oddly enough, is to make some antimony. That is required to make the battery alloy outside. Now, I'm going to be making these MV batteries mostly out of lithium, but I did make a few LVs and maybe some MVs out of cadmium, which I kid you not is only used in batteries, and a couple recipes at that. It's pretty much worthless. So that's good to know. And now that I think about it, there's some really interesting shenanigans you can do with the CEF, and that is actually to do with what batteries you can put inside of it. You see, you can put any battery inside of that thing at any tier, and this includes stuff like the flux capacitor from thermal expansion. So I actually had the ability to get like a, 4 to 8 million battery in there right now if I really wanted to, but the Gregtech ones are obviously just cheaper and easier to mass produce, especially when one battery equals 1 amp of capacity, so I'm gonna need a lot of batteries in there. Much like in Gregtech New Horizons, the MV tier unlocks a ton of machines that I didn't have access to before. The single most important one is obviously the extruder. This is generally a direct upgrade to most things. It allows me to make all sorts of things like pipes, gears, and certain other things like wires a bit easier. Now, I say wires, but the wire mill is still technically better for most wires, but there's going to be literally one use case for the wire mold later on. That is, of course, borosilicate glass fibers, but we'll get there eventually. It's mostly going to be used for gears. That's all you got to know. The one thing that I was thinking about when I was playing this pack that I find really funny is I've been watching Nine's Gregtech New Horizons playthrough on a super flat world, and he was talking about how bad the lathe is compared to the extruder in New Horizons, and I totally get him, because in New Horizons, the lathe actually produces a dust on top of the rod you get, so even though it's more efficient, you get some dust back instead of just one rod from an ingot. Yeah, the lathe in here is way different and infinitely better, as it should be. Instead of giving one rod and one dust, it just gives you straight up 2 rods, so you don't have to use the extruder to make rods, which is very nice. I will definitely say, this Nomifactory version of Gregtech and then New Horizons, they both have their ups and downs. I can't say that I like Nomifactory more than New Horizons. I think NH is like my favorite mod pack of all time, but this mod pack was certainly very interesting and had a lot of cool stuff inside of it. After countless hours, I'm finally preparing to go to the Nether. Again, for real this time. The problem is that I need a lot of stuff before I can actually go there. First, I need circuits, specifically MV circuits, which requires a lot of LV, these very primal circuits. Naturally, I should be making the better recipes for these in the assembler, but oh well, it's a bit too late for that. The main thing I need to work on right now is the atomic reconstructor. I think that's what it's called. It's the laser thingy from Actually Editions. We all know it. We all hate it because it's a pain to automate, but it is very useful for converting certain things. It has a bunch of unique parts like MV emitters. I just need like quartz, electrum rods, circuits. Those are easy enough. It requires an Ender Eye lens, which requires an Eye of Ender, which you have to make in a chemical reactor, of course, and an autoclave, which isn't that bad. I already have one. Some lead and some aluminum on top of a black quartz. These are all easy enough. I have them all in storage. And now I have my laser. Using the atomic constructor, I can finally convert some sand into soul sand. And this is the final thing I need to make my nether cake. Conveniently, it's easy enough to get an overworld cake from one of the missions, or I completely forgot that you can just use the /home command. That's a bit easier. I completely forgot to mention, one of the cool things that this pack does is actually give you like super speed when you climb ladders, which is really convenient in the early game. Of course, it's also super easy to get ender pearls to make elevators, but still, nice feature there. Now, if only the vines didn't keep spreading everywhere, then this pack would be perfect. Also, the fact that the hang glider is from open gliders and not open blocks. Yeah, it has durability, which I really hate. Hang gliders should not have a durability at all, but whatever. Actually, wait a minute. Even Gregtech New Horizons doesn't have durability on the hang glider. By the way. Anyways, now that I'm in the nether, I can start harvesting some lava. This place also has all sorts of ores, including a ton of quartz. As you could probably guess, this is the nether. But it's also got some stuff like magnetite, aka gold veins, which is very nice. And yeah, lava. That's the main thing we're here for. I'm going to be using all of this ender tech to teleport it back to my base, and this is how I'm going to have MB power. For as much as I like most of the stuff in Nomifactory, it has its major issues, and this is the absolute biggest one: multi-blocks. So, I will admit, playing Gregtech New Horizons has very much spoiled me on how crazy their multi-block customization is, especially with the most recent 2.9 update when it officially comes out. They will allow you to customize the electric blast furnace even better, because actually the multi-block customization is horrible for those right now, but I think you can place like anything anywhere on it in the next update, which is nice. That is one of the things I'll say about this pack. You can pretty much place anything anywhere on the electric blast furnace. However, they do not like being stacked together. That is the number one issue here. Multi-blocks do not like sharing hatches in this pack, which is an absolute tragedy because it makes things so much more efficient in New Horizons, but oh well, it's just something I have to learn to deal with in here, unfortunately. Something I absolutely should have noted earlier on in the video is that I'm currently playing on the version 1.2.2.21 or something like that. It's the 1.2 version of this pack, essentially. Apparently, this version is several years old. Of course, I didn't know any of this until I did all the research on this multi-block stuff. So apparently there is a far newer 1.3 like developer version or whatever, and long story short, as you can probably tell by my map, I migrated the save to this newer version. I forgot to transfer over the map and everything. But yeah, unfortunately, this doesn't fix the blast furnace, but apparently it does change and fix a lot of stuff in this pack and balance out the endgame a bit better. So that's something you guys probably should very much know. Thankfully, I can still use my standard tools to break all the Gregtech blocks instead of requiring a wrench. That is one thing I like about this pack a lot. Having to dismantle multi-blocks with the wrench in Gregtech New Horizons is painfully slow. until you get something decent like an electric wrench, which as a matter of fact don't really work in here. I tried to make, I think it was like an LV wrench because the tiers work really weird, but I could never charge it for some reason. It works perfectly fine for crafting, just not breaking anything. Originally for this blast furnace setup, I was actually using nickel wire as my power cable because I didn't have enough stuff to make enough, well, energetic alloy wires. Unfortunately, the cable loss was so high. I mean, it's only like 2 per block, actually 2 per wire. I'm not sure how it calculates in here compared to New Horizons. Whatever, the loss was way too high, long story short. And I lost a ton of power that way. It doesn't help that magma power sucks in the first place. So I finally replaced it with enough energetic alloy wires and even made some out of rubber so that I stopped electrocuting myself. That's pretty nice. One of the big things that I want to work on is getting specific resources, like say things from mobs. The only problem is that mobs don't actually spawn in peaceful mode. To deal with that, I need to work on the hostile mob networks mod, or neural networks, whatever it's called. One of the things I'm going to need for this is string to make carbon mesh. The problem is that I don't have spiders, and string is not that common in chests. The way to make string is actually fascinating. It's from the Hooked mod. You gotta make some plant fiber using a sword and saplings, and then combine those to make string. So, fascinating recipe. I really like it. Besides that, I need all sorts of stuff like vibrant alloy, electric steel, MV circuits, pulsating iron, pulsating dust to make the pulsating mesh and all of that stuff. Not to mention dark steel, which requires steel and obsidian. You can actually use void crystals, which is coal thrown into the atomic reconstructor, but I have a lot of obsidian when I was gathering some lava earlier on. Combining all of this stuff will allow me to finally make a simulation chamber and loot fabricator. These are the 2 key buildings in mob neural networks, and this will allow me to start generating mob drops. Also, apparently the mod is called Deep Mob Learning. I get it mixed up because I feel like there's different versions or forks of this mod. Whatever, I have all the stuff I need except for the mob data itself. Thankfully, to get the actual mob data, you just need some of those materials from earlier and some electrum wire, which is easy enough. However, you're probably wondering, how do we actually get mob data? You see, normally with this mod, you actually have to go and find the mobs in the world, kill them, and collect enough data to get your first tier research. Thankfully, you don't have to do that in here. All you have to do is make like a basic zombie model with some rotten flesh, or a skeleton model with a bone, which you can get from looting chests around the world. That's easy enough. And from there, those models will give you overworld matter that you can use to start making other overworld data. You can combine it to make nether and eventually ender matter, and that's how you get all of your other models. It's pretty easy. And thankfully, all of these crafted models start at the basic tier so that you don't have to kill whatever mob you're looking for. Alright, I've been doing a ton of exploring, and at this point I feel really stupid because I only figured this stuff out way later on. Alright, I decided to make a couple of upgrades for that scanner. And now, you see, one of the quests actually tells you to do this early on, and I should have listened because this is potentially the most powerful upgrade overall. This allows me to scan for specific blocks. Of course, I have to figure out how it works first. But essentially, you take the augment out and then shift right-click whatever block you want, and that kind of programs it for a specific block. You throw that into the scanner, and you can find specific things way easier. This not only includes ores, but can be any block in the game, including stuff, say, chests, so that you can loot the lost cities way easier. That's something I wish I would have known way earlier on. The second thing, one of the reasons I went exploring earlier on was to get clay. Like an idiot, I've been mining clay from, well, the ocean, which is really slow and annoying. But you see, the easier way to get clay, I mean, look around me. One of the big mods is obviously lost cities. Do you guys know what most of the buildings in the lost cities are made out of? Terracotta. Terracotta is literally just hardened clay. Yeah, you literally throw this clay into a macerator, however you say it, pulverize it, and it gives you clay dust. Thankfully, in this mod, you can just combine the clay dust to make clay blocks, which is insanely easy and convenient. So you just tear down a few buildings and you never have to worry about clay again. Or be actually smart and just automate it with some pulverizers in the chemical bath, but oh well. In case you were wondering, the reason I need clay is to make pulsating clay, which is required to actually use the mob simulations. And that's also the reason I'm looking for more of this uranite ore to go and get some pulsating dust. You see, the intended way to get more of the pulsating dust is by making this I don't even know how to pronounce this stupid thing. It's a word I've never heard before, but it requires like ender pearls and quartz, which is very expensive, so I'd rather not deal with that. I've found it much more worth it to just go out and mine a ton of uranite ore, because these veins also contain uranium-238, which is going to be important later on. Another fascinating change that Omni and Nomifactory make is that you can start applied Engergistics really early on. Like from the beginning of MV age, you get access to everything you need to start it. However, I kinda waited way too long to start this. I should have started it infinitely earlier, just like in New Horizons, where even though I unlock it at a certain tier, I decided not to use it until way later. At least in New Horizons, I could say that it's insanely expensive and requires a ton of titanium to do applied Engergistics, but here, no, it's actually relatively cheap for everything. It's not too bad. Unfortunately though, there's no nice fluix recipes where you can automate it. You still have to make the fluix yourself or make like a dropper setup with water, so that's kind of annoying. But yeah, I should have made more use of this than I did early on because it's so insanely powerful. And you'll really see that later on when I get up to some crazy stuff with applied Engergistics. So you can actually craft all of the inscriber presses that you need for applied Engergistics. It requires a bunch of different resources and lenses, but I decided to just go ahead and find them throughout the world because I think exploring is a bit more fun sometimes. But it can be really annoying to find some of the meteors, like this one for example. That's why I was in spectator mode for a bit, and it took me a while to figure out what I should have done instead. Once you find one of these meteors, guess what? You guys remember the scanner from earlier? The block scan option? Well, guess what? Skystone chests are a block. You literally just find one meteor, put that in the scanner, and yeah, it's easy from there. Especially with 2 range upgrades, you can find these really easily. So there's a good tip for this pack, and I guess anything that has that scannable mod. It's a shame there aren't nearly as many multi-blocks as there are in New Horizons, because that's like one of my new favorite things, but there are still plenty of interesting ones, including the Pyrolos oven. This has all sorts of uses, much like in NH, but in here I'm going to be needing it to make phenol. Phenol is a gas? I'm pretty sure. It's some sort of, classic carbon hydrogen compound thing. You normally get it in New Horizons from distilling, I think it's like wood tar that produces it. It's normally just like a byproduct though. I'm always looking for like the benzene and toluene. And this is a process where I will be getting those later on for other stuff. But in here, I need phenol to actually produce the next tier of boards that I need for new circuits. Of course though, those circuits and boards will only be temporary, because long term you don't need the phenol tier. I think it's like plastic boards that can replace all of those circuits. But of course it is necessary for now, so I might as well get it set up. This thing also requires steam as an input besides the coal, but that's easy enough considering, I have a steam generator. With the wonderful power of the assembly machine, I can now make a ton of circuits far cheaper than before. That's also going to be important when considering I want to start applied Engergistics, because all of the parts, like the processors for applied Engergistics, those cost 1 circuit per processor. Yeah, it's painfully expensive, trust me. And speaking of painful, I kind of forgot that in base applied Engergistics, the inscribers only process one recipe at a time, and they can't be automated with hoppers. Only the advanced inscribers can be automated with hoppers and hold more than one item at a time. It's really stupid and annoying. I kind of forgot how nice it is in Gregtech New Horizons because you can actually use the forming press to do a lot of applied Engergistics crafting, and it's infinitely easier and sometimes faster than default AE2, which is really nice. I've been hunting for some more ores for resources that I need to make some other stuff. You get the point. When I happened to come across a tungsten vein, which I didn't even know was possible. Definitely not in normal New Horizons. But in here, yeah, tungsten and platinum spawn in the overworld. They're just insanely rare, but very tiny veins, which is unfortunate. Both of these are far more common in the end, which I'll get to a while later, but unfortunately I still haven't found the ore that I've been searching for this entire time. Thankfully, there is always the option to use Nomi coins to buy certain ores. Actually, there's a huge selection. I always prefer mining instead of spending coins, but you know, it recommends you use them. I forgot how much I saved up by the end, but yeah, I barely spent my coins. I only ever really used the coins to get this drill, as a matter of fact, because I could not find a drill core for the life of me. It's just kind of rare, I guess, but I did happen to find a lot of them in the end. So I had to purchase some pyrrolose ore. This stuff contains modolium. The element is like MO, and I need that stuff for a specific... Honestly, I can't remember if I needed pyrrolose or I think I needed magnesium for something. I know I also needed the MO modolium or whatever for something else later on. Whatever. Next up, I'm going to be doing some kind of weird steps to make one of the most important items in the entire playthrough. I'm not even kidding. So, I want to make another set of mob data. Unfortunately, this one is very unique and requires some, well, unique resources. First of all, snowballs. Since I spawned in the middle of an ocean, even though it is a, Lost Cities biome, so the city is built up all around it, whatever, I don't have access to snow, meaning I'll have to use the machine, or fluid solidifier with water to make snowballs, and I'm going to need hydrofluoric acid, which is hydrogen and fluorine, combined with some pulsating dust to get what I want. You see, I'm trying to make a thermal elemental mob data set. This will allow me to get resources from the thermal dynamics, like blitz, basalts, the blaze alternative thingies. There's also a standard blaze one which I will need. All of these resources are going to be insanely important later on for, all sorts of crafting stuff, but like one essential part of the pack that you'll see eventually. The next thing I'm working on is going to be another major step in progression. I've been working on some chemicals. The first one is ethanol. This is insanely annoying to make, at least early on, because it requires fermenting. Well, I think it's a fermenter, whatever. It requires sugar cane and water to get biomass. The biomass then goes in a distillery to make ethanol. Ethanol has some uses, including a fuel, but for now, I have to combine it with sulfuric acid. Thankfully, sulfuric acid is just a combination of water and sulfur, which is very nice. But combining the ethanol and sulfuric acid allows me to make ethylene, which is insanely important. If you didn't know, ethylene can easily be turned into polyethylene with the combination of oxygen, and polyethylene is going to be my first plastic. That polyethylene is going to be turned into, plates, technically with this fluid solidifier, and then boards to make even more, better, and new circuits. On top of that, it allows me to make new components for the circuits, which is very exciting. Polyethylene is required to make all of what's called surface mount devices, unfortunate acronym, but these surface mount devices, resistors, capacitors, transistors, diodes, are all going to be required for the entire rest of the run. I'm not even joking. Every single circuit is going to require one of these in some capacity from now on. So it's good to get them at least a tiny bit produced early on. The slight problem with all this is that creating plastic requires a lot of time. The biomass and ethanol are insanely slow. All of the recipes are just ridiculously slow. Thankfully, I will be able to automate it and make it way faster later on, especially with the help of both like a distillation tower so I can get more products out of certain things, and oil processing long term. But that's still very far away. I'm gonna need at least HV to get like stainless steel for a distillation tower. Now that I have all of these beautiful new components, I can finally start making cheaper tier 2 circuits. Actually, I've been making those for a while now, and tier 3 circuits for the first time. Of course, this gets far more expensive, at least for a little bit. Gregtech is like a weird paradox when it comes to circuits. They get both cheaper and more expensive at the same time. So even though it's a bit easier to make each tier of circuits when you get like the next batch of resources, they are technically more expensive in the whole picture of things. But they're also technically cheaper because those hard resources are easier to make later on. It's really weird. Also, I haven't even mentioned this, but I made a laser engraver a while ago, as well as some silicone boules. They're just really basic things. I think it's like gallium? Yeah, you don't even need gallium arsenide, I think. I actually can't remember. But yeah, you need some silicone to make boules. That's easy enough. You gotta cut those up with a cutter. For now, I'm just using water because it's easy enough. I'll get lubricant later on. And I threw them in a laser engraver with a red lens. Now here's the funny part. The red lens is literally useless after this. It is only used to make integrated circuits for this specific tier. That's it. It has one single crafting recipe. It's really dumb if you ask me. Kinda sucks because I made a ton of those circuits, but oh well. That's one of the many things I should have just checked in the crafting recipe first to see if I actually needed it. Anyways, tier 3 circuits allow me to make a tier 2 assembler, which is also the next tier circuit assembler. They're both the same thing here. So now I can get started on, you guessed it, the next tier of circuits. Oh boy. However, the first thing I need to do before I can really get started on more circuits is actually making fluid processors. Now that I'm looking at this footage, I'm kind of disgusted that I'm using Certus quartz crystals and not pure crystals, because pure crystals are actually half the cost of standard ones. Because one crystal, if you turn it into dust, gives you 2 pure seeds. Those seeds are thrown in the growth accelerator and you get 2 pure crystals. Yeah, it's way cheaper and easier. I didn't realize this until way later though. But I want to make a ton of different fluid processors so that I can get some fluid storage going. I'm going to be making a ton of stuff like oxygen and hydrogen from electrolyzing all of my resources. Mostly oxygen for now though. And looking at it now, this is a tiny bit silly, but I have a bunch of oil sand ore, and instead of using it to actually make, well, oil in the refinery and all that stuff, I decided to just throw it in a mixer with redstone to get lubricant. Lubricant, if you didn't know, is the best lubricant for cutting things with the cutting machine. So instead of having to deal with the super slow time of water, you can just use lubricant instead. I was talking about this in my Gregtech New Horizons playthrough, but it almost feels too easy to make this stuff, especially in there where you can get creosote oil for practically free, and you can just make lubricant. Such a powerful resource so early on. It almost doesn't feel right. And finally, I can start producing some surface mount device, well, products. They all require different things. You've got combinations of like copper wire. This is technically annealed copper that has to be thrown in a blast furnace with oxygen, gallium, electrum, carbon. You've got aluminum, and even this is polyvinyl chloride sheets. But later on, I will be able to make silicone rubber sheets for a bit cheaper. Polyvinyl chloride just requires polyethylene, or okay, technically ethylene first, and then chlorine. With the vinyl ethylene, you can turn that into PVC. You get the point. For a while now, I've been working on making a ton of stainless steel using all of my blast furnaces, trust me this took a while, so that I could finally build myself a distillation tower. This is going to be very important for processing stuff like oil later on, but for now I can use my pyrolysis oven to make, I think it's wood tar, that you can then distill into benzene, toluene, and of course phenol, which is pretty much useless at this point, which is kind of funny, actually. But the construction is just like in Gregtech New Horizons. You've got the first layer, which has your controller, power, and input. What's unique is that the fluid input actually has to be at the middle. It can't be on the sides, so that's interesting. And of course, one output per layer. It's easy enough. If you've seen my Gregtech New Horizons playthrough, you probably know where this whole distillation tower wood tar thing is going. And yeah, I'm hoping to make my HV power setup using benzene. Unfortunately, benzene isn't actually the best fuel in here. I can't remember what it is. It's actually like toluene or phenol, which is fine because they're pretty much useless for anything else at this point. The toluene will be helpful like by the end of the game. That's about it. So I will save up a tiny bit of that for now, but everything else is going to be thrown into power. Except the creosote oil, because I can't really burn that. I'd have to build a steam boiler for it. So yeah, the creosote oil is just going to be vented. I don't need that much lubricant throughout the run. After that, I know this seems very random, and it kind of is, but it will be helpful later on. I'm working on a tiny bit of extra utility stuff. I'm creating some stone burnt so that I can get grid power by making other grid generators, so I can actually automate stone burnt. This stuff doesn't have many uses, but it is required to make a building or item, I guess, called the screen. The screen is used in a lot of other buildings that I'll make later on, so it is nice to have plenty of resources to make them lying around. I also decided to start setting up some automation with applied Engergistics. Now, I'll get into more detail about all of this later, but I did need a basic crafting CPU. And I realized this only near the end, but 16k is kind of overkill, especially early on. All you truly need is like a couple of 1Ks, maybe 4K, and just a ton of co-processors. That's pretty much, from my experience, all I've needed until the very late game where you're crafting extremely complicated things. Then you might want some 16 or 64Ks. Still, you should get automation started as soon as physically possible in every single pack. That is what I truly learned from this pack. I've been working on all sorts of other stuff, including making another distillation tower. Actually, I'm pretty sure I moved the first one I made, and I'm working on a second one here, but this is for oil processing. The setup looks horrible. It absolutely sucks, I can confirm that, and it is full of problems that I'll deal with later on consistently. Well, actually, that's the second oil setup that's gonna have all the problems. This one wasn't actually bad, I have to admit. I have a bunch of chemical reactors, I think it is, on the output of the distillery, and that, like, desulfurizes all of the hydrogen or oil products that come out. You've got heavy fuel, light fuel, naphtha, refinery gas, and it outputs hydrogen sulfide. I put that back into an electrolyzer to get my hydrogen back since I don't have much of that, and I put the sulfur into a chest. All of these resources are going to be used for various reasons. For now, the naphtha, I can't actually remember what I did with it, but I know for a fact the refinery gas was centrifuged to make LPG and methane, which are both burnable fuels that I can use. And light fuel and heavy fuel were obviously mixed together to make diesel, or standard fuel. And the naphtha, I actually have no clue what I did with it. Maybe I just stored it because it is actually useful for later, but I kind of forgot at this point. Sometimes looking back at footage, I even surprise myself because I could have sworn that I didn't do this part until later, but I guess I did. The naphtha is actually thrown in another chemical reactor with steam. This allows me to steam crack the naphtha and throw it back into a distillation tower. It's the one on the right. It has like 11 tiers, and most of it is just random small stuff, benzene, toluene, all of those gas thingies, but it also produces some heavy fuel, or is it light fuel? It produces some fuel that I could also throw back into the mix to make more fuel. Again, a lot of this stuff is going to be useless, but at the same time, some of it's pretty necessary. I think this can also produce a bit of ethylene, which is very nice. I spent a while after that working on making one specific building. This thing was quite expensive. It's called the farming station. It even requires a zombie. It's not the Franken zombie, but zombie controller from Ender.io. And in case you're wondering how I made that without the slice and splice, you can actually make that specific recipe with wafers, I think, and some other electronic components, so it's not very difficult. But of course, all of the crystals, the pulsating and vibrant ones, those are quite expensive. Anyways, I have been getting a ton of these capacitors from dungeons all across the world. I say dungeons, you guys know what I mean, they're the chests in the buildings, whatever. So I searched it up and I actually found a list of what like all of these modifiers, if you will, do. And I want to try out a bunch of these different capacitors because some of these are insanely powerful. Now, I don't think these can ever be as good as like the double compressed capacitor that you can make, the tier 5, but they will definitely serve for now. One of the next important things that I'm going to be working on is making a bunch of black steel. This is a crazy combination of several components, including steel, bismuth, bronze, or is that for later? I think it's black bronze, which requires something. I honestly can't remember at this point. But the two most interesting ingredients are void shards, whatever the void crystals are. Those are from actually additions. I just have to throw coal into my reconstructor, and red coal, which is actually made in the extra utilities resonator. So it's still very useful there. Oh, and the reason I was spawning in these plates is because I kind of don't have an electric blast furnace up right now, and I don't really want to rebuild one. So we'll just have to deal with that for now. Anyways, the last and most important thing I'm currently working on is something called luminescence. This requires a combination of energetic blend, aluminum dust, and phosphoric acid, which requires me to electrolyze phosphorus of whatever type all the way down to, well, phosphor, and combine that with oxygen. Luminescence, and funnily enough, the black steel I was just making, are going to be used in pretty much every like late game component for this extended crafting mod. So get used to seeing these because I will be making a lot of this stuff. The other primary reason I want this so bad is because luminescence will also let me get to the end. Same with the black steel plates. I need both of these components to actually make a cake to go to the end. By combining luminescence and lava, I was able to make end stone, which is the last component for my cake. One thing we'll admit is that it's been like way too long since I've played default Minecraft, or even anything like this, because I totally forgot that the Ender Dragon still spawns even in peaceful mode. I'm not sure if that's just a thing in this pack, and my memory is horrible, but I think she always spawns no matter what. I know the Wither disappears in peaceful, but yeah, I kind of forgot that happens. Since you're probably wondering why I traveled to the end, well, I kind of said it earlier, I guess, but this place is full of all sorts of really good rare ores, like platinum, palladium, tungsten of various types, grossular, and all this ore, however you pronounce it, that contains not magnesite, mobolium, or whatever. They contain some really good ores, on top of draconium being just everywhere, because it's the end, and the end cities having insanely good loot. So I'm gonna come here several times to just get as much ore as possible because, well, it's all really high tier useful stuff. And on my first trip back, I decided to bring a decent sword I found in the end, and one of the dark bows that I found. Using these, I killed the Ender Dragon, stole both her heart, her egg, and, well, all of her other drops, I guess. All of these drops will be very important at a later time. Now that I have diesel, I absolutely need to turn it into turbo diesel, mostly because it has a higher power density compared to diesel, and it's super easy. All it requires is like hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and sulfuric acid. All really easy to get. Besides the power, I'm going to need it for later on as well, because it's actually required to make zirconium ingots, which is fascinating. So I'm going to need a lot of this stuff. And right now, I've been working towards getting all of my machinery, well, automated, but more importantly in HV. The problem is I had to make an MV alloy smelter to make things go faster, because I kinda can't make higher tier coils, or wires specifically, just yet. You see, I'm going to need canthal, and the primary issue with canthal is that it requires a vacuum freezer. There's no fancy chemical reactor coolant recipe in here. And the vacuum freezer literally requires tier 4 circuits, which I can technically make at this point, but I'd rather not deal with it just yet. That's gonna be a whole thing. This is just a quick, easy solution. The thing I've been working for a while now is epoxy, or epoxide resin, whatever it's called. I require all sorts of different chemicals to make this stuff. Hydrochloric acid, easy enough. Acetone, I actually get from distilling, not wood tar, wood vinegar. That's why I actually built the farm earlier, so I can farm tons of trees and, well, throw those into the pyrolysis oven. You get the point. As well as phenol, which I can get from wood tar. I have a bunch left over. That is like the first half of the equation. That's to make the bisphenol A. And for the second part, I need glycerol, however it's pronounced, which you actually get by combining ethanol and seed oil of any sort. I also made a small canola farm, and I'm just straight up pulling the seed oil out instead of pressing it. It's just better for me this way. I will use canola oil itself later on, but this combined with more hydrochloric acid gives me epichlorophene, whatever the heck it's called. This is epoxy A and B, essentially. Fun fact, these are the exact two chemicals that are used to make epoxy resins in real life. Like, I didn't know that. I knew this was realistic, but yeah, these are part A and B resins. Super cool stuff. And in case you didn't know, this stuff is used to make epoxy boards for my next circuits. With that, I'm actually not 100% sure if I needed the epoxy. I'm guessing I did to make these circuit boards. It was so long ago, I can't even remember, and I don't have any notes on that. Whatever. I'm finally building a vacuum freezer. This is going to allow me to do, well, all sorts of new things. Mostly make a whole lot of new ingots and alloys that I couldn't before because they had to be frozen, and I can freeze some liquid, which will come in handy for some things later on. Now that I can actually start, well, cooling all of these ingots, I first made canthal coils, just 16, enough to actually smelt some nichrome. Canthal requires iron, aluminum, and something else. It might be nickel, I actually can't remember. Nichrome is obviously nickel and chrome, and this will let me make, well, guess what, even further alloys that I can turn into coils. Now, unfortunately, in this pack, the only thing coils do for your blast furnace is let you make new materials. In Gregtech New Horizons, the higher tier coils you have, like the higher heat over the recipe, you actually get overclocks, so it goes even faster. It's a shame that's not a thing in here, but it is what it is. I don't know how it's taken me somewhere around 10 years of playing Minecraft mods to only now understand the true potential of applied Engergistics. I was starting to learn it in the past few episodes of Gregtech New Horizons, but this pack is what made me truly understand how everything works. You see, I've always had like a mental block when it comes to automation. Like, automating everything feels like such a pain, and that's why I hate doing it. But now I realize how much time I waste by handcrafting everything instead. Like, sure, it takes a while to set up all the patterns and recipes for all the automation stuff, but once you have that set up and you can make the buildings to automate the buildings, it's kind of overpowered to say the least. Especially by the end, you'll see how I can just request an item, and without having to do any further work, all the machines process the recipes and create whatever I want. It's pretty awesome. Unfortunately, in this pack, there isn't fluid crafting like there is in Gregtech New Horizons, but that is easy enough to work around if you know what you're doing. For example, I have an assembler dedicated to polyethylene that's used for a lot of early machine holes and some specific parts. Same thing with silicone rubber. That's where I make all of my pumps and various other recipes. It's pretty nice because you can put a ton of recipes in the same assembler as long as you set it to blocking mode so it doesn't try to do multiple recipes at the same time. Yeah, I'm trying to squeeze as much stuff into as little space as possible here, and it works out really well. So I think I've finally learned my lesson. Automation is very important, especially in packs like this, where it is literally required because it's going to take you hundreds of hours of gameplay either way. The next major thing that I'm going to be working on is technically more like two things, I guess. I want to make titanium and tungsten, as those are going to be necessary for upcoming tiers. The problem is that both of them take a very long time to make and are incredibly expensive. Starting out, you can see I'm currently making tungsten. I have some titanium done already. For tungsten, of course, the ore itself is rare. You gotta process it down into dust, and that dust has to be electrolyzed, which takes hours, because I can only do it in EV currently, and even then it's slow. On top of that, it requires hydrogen, which I don't have a ton of just yet, so painfully expensive and slow. And then of course tungsten has to be thrown into a blast furnace and cooled down into ingots. Alright, that's pretty annoying. Titanium is another beast entirely. To get titanium, I have to get rudolite ore, which can also come from immoltite, but rudolite is a bit easier to acquire. You can get a lot of it from bauxite production and just ore by itself, which is nice. I have to combine that with some carbon and chlorine to get titanium tetrachloride. The titanium tetrachloride, that's a complicated word, goes into an electric blast furnace with magnesium. Now, this sounds like a really bizarre process. Apparently, this is what they do in real life. Not exactly, obviously there's specialized machinery required, but it's insane because I never thought this process was real until I searched it up, and yeah, that's how it works. They have to use chlorine gas and magnesium, because titanium is weird like that. And funnily enough, the process to make tungsten is kind of realistic as well, because hydrogen is actually used to form the tungsten ingots, because tungsten has the highest melting point of any metal. It's like 6,300 degrees Fahrenheit. So yeah, some very fascinating knowledge you can learn from playing Gregtech. A turbo fun fact, by the way, titanium is like the 9th most common element on Earth. I don't know if it's in the crust or whatever, but it's the 9th most common. The reason it's so rare and expensive to produce is because of how much the materials and all the manufacturing actually costs. So fascinating knowledge I've learned from playing this pack. Research after the fact, but you know, curiosity is what matters here. While I'm kind of on this track of fun facts about all sorts of resources, I'm currently working on getting rare earth. This can be acquired from monzonite and redstone processing, I think, in this pack as well. It's super easy, you'll get a ton of rare earth, but you don't really need too much of it in this pack. The fascinating thing I learned about rare earth, in real life at least, is that it's not technically rare, like the material itself, but it's called rare earth because all of the elements inside of it are incredibly difficult to remove. If you've played Gregtech New Horizons or seen my videos on it, you will probably know about the plat line and the absolute nightmare that is. I haven't even gotten to monzonite and bastonite lines, which are infinitely worse. Okay, probably not infinitely. Platinum wasn't as bad as people say it is. It just takes a lot of effort and micromanagement of all of your resources. That's why these things are considered rare in real life, because they're so hard to process. Kinda like titanium and tungsten. This is when I finally decided to start working on automating resin itself, which is insanely difficult, so I could only get parts of it done. The primary issue was actually making the canola oil. You see, in this pack, since it's like a different version of applied Engergistics, the P2P ports do not play nice with each other. They don't like to work with me at all. So yeah, fluid P2P is just out of the question, unfortunately. I used it for one thing. It was one of the distillation towers earlier, but I could never really get it to work again. It's a horribly buggy system in this pack. But I built some default canola presses that make straight up canola oil. It's a better ratio than the tiny bit of seed oil that it gives you, but it's way slower and requires RF instead. Thankfully, I could build that on a line where I place some EU generators, but then a CEU to make RF, which also powers my applied Engergistics system now. I know this is all super complicated, but we've just started. And you can probably guess what I'm making here. Yes, it's another electric blast furnace. I'm going to need a ton of these throughout the entire playthrough. I definitely should have some set up already producing stuff like red alloy, annealed copper, vibrant alloy, energetic, all of this stuff should just be passively automated. Oh well. Currently, I'm building this one out of tungsten steel, that's the coils. It's a combination of, go figure, tungsten and steel. I call it tung steel. That was kind of just a mistake. My brain mashed those two words together, but at the same time, I kind of like it more. It's easier to say. So, as you can probably guess, this new blast furnace will allow me to produce even more higher tier materials. On top of that, there's a specialized thing. It's like nickel zinc ferrite oxide ingot of some sort that I can make, and then this yttrium barium cuprite thingy. These are two specialized ingots that have different uses. The yttrium copper barite thing will be useful way later on. A tiny bit for now, but it does come in handy in some endgame wires. And then the nickel ferrite stuff that I'm gonna make, well, probably later on, will be useful for electronics. It's used to make a bolt for one specific thing, but the recipe is infinitely cheaper. I've been getting a ton of stuff done, and it's getting me very close to being able to make, well, one of my largest goals for a while. Yes, power is still very much an issue, but I should be able to solve that very soon. Unfortunately, getting the high tier circuits I need to make the next tier of assembler to get easier circuits, you know the deal. These are painfully expensive, as you can see. End steel wires, which I think it's dark steel and end stone dust. It's one of those combos. Titanium frames, a ton of surface mount components, and some of the previous tiers of circuits. Yeah, these absolutely suck, but all tiers always will. Thankfully, I only need a few so I can make the next assembler, and yeah. All of the materials I've been working on gathering have led up to this moment. I am starting to get some Nuclearcraft components. Nuclearcraft is going to be my primary power source for basically the rest of the run, but I will get to that a little bit later on. Now, Nuclearcraft has several issues, especially in this pack. Thankfully, radiation is disabled, so I don't have to worry about that, and power generation is multiplied by 5 to compensate for needing 4 times the power, essentially. But the first major pain point is the resources needed to actually make, for example, the casing and the controller. The advanced plating requires some of that material I made earlier, the yttrium copper. However, it also requires basic plating. Basic plating is the absolute worst to make. Basic plating requires tungsten plates. Tungsten, like I've said before, takes forever to produce, and it consumes a ton of power to make on top of that. That's the largest pain point so far. On top of that, I need tungsten steel casings, which require a ton of tungsten steel frames, which is rods and plates. It's pretty bad. And on top of how long it takes to make all of the parts for this stuff, to make the nuclear fuel itself, you have to process your dust, like uranium or thorium, in a thermal centrifuge, which takes... The power draw isn't even bad, it's just 1 amp, unlike Gregtech, which is 3 amps I think it takes. Unlike New Horizons, where it takes 3 amps, I think, but it is just so unbelievably slow. I'm gonna have these running pretty much permanently from now on. I have to because of how slow they are and how much dust I have in storage, so it's really gonna suck making the fuel for this stuff. On top of everything, I need to make another component, which I will need later on, so it's good. I'm kind of making a lot of it now, but this is advanced alloy. Thankfully, there are a ton of ways to make advanced alloy, and the more expensive materials you use, the more alloy you get out of it. So for this, I'm going to be using brass, aluminum, and tungsteel plates. These are the most expensive ones I can afford right now, and it's going to give me like 6 stacks of advanced plates, which is really good. It might be even more, I can't remember exactly. I need these advanced plates to actually make reactor cells. Now here's where things get really interesting. Building the reactor itself. These all require a lot of things like lithium, steel, boron, and that's just to make the casings and stuff. On top of that, I need to make other things like moderator blocks, which cost graphite. Graphite isn't difficult because it's found in the same veins as diamonds, so I have plenty of it. I just have to process it down and then put it in a furnace to get the ingots to make blocks. One of the worst parts of all this is the coolers. These coolers, besides the expensive outer frames, they actually require you to use a canning machine to, well, put the resources inside of them. In this case, glowstone and copper dust. I'm using a reactor design I found online. I will get to more reactor designs a bit later on, but this one works really well for thorium. It produces some power at the very least. It's really bad, like Nuclearcraft is horrible for power most of the time, but it's better than nothing and it's far cheaper than the turbo diesel I've been using. Unfortunately, I won't be using it to power that entire like HV setup, but I will make a small EV setup for now. Of course, I just had to wait quite a while for all of the tungsten to actually process so I could make, reactor plating, the outside of this thing, but that was the worst of it. Now that I have some actual thorium to work with, I can finally start making a tiny bit of fuel. It's not much at all, and unfortunately, thorium produces the least amount of fuel in the game. But that allows me to make 16,000 RF a tick, which is essentially 4,000 EU, and that's decent, I guess. That is almost 2 EV, so I guess I'll take it. And this is when I learned that you actually need the proper gauge of wire, because, yeah, this pack kind of freaking sucks. But anyways, I have been working on 2 giant buildings, as you can probably see there. One is a vacuum freezer. That's pretty simple. The other one is called a cryogenic distillation tower. Now, this is a fascinating building. I guess you use the normal distillation tower in Gregtech New Horizons. I actually can't remember. Yeah, I think it might be a normal distillation tower. I guess I'd have to check. I haven't gotten to using it at this point in my playthrough there. Anyways, the cryogenic distillation tower consumes a ton, and I mean metric tons, of liquid air, which requires air in the first place. There's a little block that automatically collects it. It goes into the vacuum freezer, and liquid air then gets transported into the tower. From this liquid air, I get stuff like oxygen, nitrogen, the 2 most abundant, some carbon dioxide, and a tiny bit, like 1,000 liters per operation of noble gases. I need 53 stacks, or 53,000, of this noble gases to throw back into the machine. The noble gases are where it's really at. All the other products can be kind of used, but they will mostly be trashed at the end. But for now, the reason I want noble gases is because it gives me insanely good stuff, like argon, krypton, helium, neon, and xenon, I think. A lot of those noble rare gases will be used later on, but there are some like argon and helium that I really need right now for certain projects. So this is a pretty important building to get. I completely forgot what the helium is going to be used for at this point, but I know that the argon I just acquired will be used to create some more bools. Now, the first tier of bools are super cheap: gallium, arsenic, and silicone. I think that's it, if that. But this tier requires even more silicone, glowstone dust, which is easy enough, and argon. This is going to be glowstone doped bools. The second tier of bool, it's obviously going to give me way more circuits and chips of all sorts. Unfortunately, I won't be able to access the final tier of bools for probably a few hundred hours. It is very close to the end game there. So yeah, it's the best upgrade I've gotten in a while. One of the things I was working on required a ton of chemical reactors all kind of combined together. I'm trying to make rocket fuel. That is the end goal. This entire process requires pretty much all of my gases at this point. You know, the classic oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, a bunch of other stuff, chlorine, and yeah, you get the point. To make dimethylbenzene, or is it it's hydrazine, because that's rocket fuel. It's a whole complicated mess. I honestly don't remember how any of it works. You just need to know that I'm making rocket fuel, and it's going to be important for two things later on. One soon, one near the end. So you guys might be able to tell what I'm currently working towards, and that is actually going to be rocketry, which I'm super excited about. I'm only going to use it for one thing because, well, I kind of lost interest after my first rocket, and it was like the stupidest, most basic thing you can possibly make. Whatever. For that, I need all sorts of things called components and catalysts. These require different crafting recipes, but they generally share at least black steel and maybe luminescence, but then you require all sorts of various plates, and it gets pretty complicated, but it's easy enough once you automate everything. Skipping what is likely hours of insanely complicated crafting, it's finally time to head off to space. I've never seen this mod before, but it's called Advanced Rocketry. You can actually make super cool custom rockets. I've seen pictures while I was trying to figure out how this stuff worked of people who made like real life rocket models and stuff like that. So it was really neat. The only issue I faced was actually one of the funniest things I've ever seen. So, long story short, I forgot to give my rocket enough power to load enough fuel, so I kind of fell back to Earth, which is actually quite hilarious, I have to say. But second time was the charm, and I'm into space. You can pre-program the flight path, and it's sending me to the moon, which is very exciting. The only slight problem that you might notice is that I don't actually have any oxygen equipped. You see, I didn't quite understand how you're supposed to, well, put it in your atmosuit, or spacesuit, atmosuit. I'm so used to playing oxygen not included. Anyways, the primary issue here was that you have to use a suit workbench, unequip your chest piece, put it in there, and then put the tanks in the chest piece. So this is just a complete knowledge gap because I've never seen this mod before, I'll say that again. So I had no clue how any of it worked, and the quests were worded a little odd. That was kind of my problem. But yes, I'm finally in space. The quests also teach you how to make dislocators and dislocator pedestals. This means that you can teleport from the overworld to the moon for completely free. These things don't lose their ability or anything. It's pretty awesome. The only problem is kind of jump height because, you know, low gravity, you jump higher. And to get out of my grappling hook, I have to jump. It's a little bit annoying having to fall back to the moon, but whatever. Now that I'm here, I can finally start collecting some resources. I think I might have mentioned it earlier, but the moon is full of good stuff like aluminum, which, you know, those veins contain bauxite and immolite, aka titanium. It's got some other rare stuff, but now that I think about it, it doesn't have platinum and palladium, unless I'm forgetting. I honestly can't remember what else I had here at this point that I used a lot of later on, but it's good stuff. The other main resource you get from the moon is deuterium from the moon dirt, soil, but besides that, the caves are legitimately just normal generated overworld caves. I guess the moon did also have tungsten. That is the other major thing I forgot. I could have sworn I got most of that from the end, but I guess not, considering how much I have in my inventory. I guess it was the moon. I smelted down some of the palladium that I found earlier on, and as far as I'm aware, this is the only use for the stuff. Like, that's it. It's not even used in endgame crafting. It's purely used to turn into a liquid to make raw carbon fiber. This requires, well, carbon dust and palladium. Quite simple. This stuff is actually used in 2 crafting recipes, but the primary use is going to be making nano CPU wafers. That requires carbon fiber, CPU wafers, and liquid glowstone, which is actually easy enough at this point. But the other recipe it's used in is to make reinforced epoxy boards. However, I'm going to be using glass fibers for that. Glass fibers are made out of borosilicate glass, which requires boron and glass dust, It's super easy and very cheap. That's why I prefer it to carbon fiber. And I kind of wanted to make it because, well, I can. Alright, so here's where things are gonna get a little bit exploitative. You'll see pretty fast. Now, magnesium lapis is actually a cooling method I've used before. This allows me to have a lot of cooling with moderators and standard reactor cells. However, I have heavily decreased the heat generation. I think, actually, I don't remember what I first changed it to. It might be 10%. Or 0.1 generation instead of 1 or 100%. This is because it's just so annoying to deal with heat from this mod, and I need so much power, and you'll see this throughout the entire playthrough, that I really hate the mechanic. I just want power. I'll start saying here what the best way to truly get power right now is, and the intended way is actually the slime data model. You guys remember that from earlier? Well, I don't know if you could see it, but the slime data model gives coins besides just slime balls, and those coins can actually be thrown into the Numication dynamo, whatever that money one is called, and that's actually a really good source of power for this early to mid game stage. However, that is a ton of work and resources to set up, when changing a setting is not. Of course, reactors are still insanely expensive because of that tungsten, but this is far more enjoyable for me. And in case you were wondering, the true endgame power generation that's intended is just solar panel spam, which is so unbelievably lame to me. There are a couple of other options, but that's technically the best one. I'll be sticking with Nuclearcraft for a while, and I'll talk about some other ones when I get to it. I have to say, this mod pack was really good in terms of like bugs and glitches, as there like weren't any real noticeable ones. I think a lot of it is just like the specific odd versions of the mods, but there was some funny stuff like this that happened. I noticed that the hooked mod breaks the game a lot. It seems to crash every so often, but there is this one where when I was trying to use a screwdriver to change settings, it broke and soft crashed the game. I say soft crash because it gives you like warnings and things stop working after a bit, but you can keep playing technically. All you have to do is save and quit and it's fine, which is really nice instead of, killing the entire game instance and I have to wait, whatever, several minutes for it to load back up. I definitely should have automated this process a little bit more. I did have a hopper to insert some of the raw carbon fiber, but I did at the same time put a lot of it in myself. Anyways, I'm currently working on making some of those new nano CPUs, which are going to be insanely important for making, well, the next tiers of circuits and some other stuff like Lapitron crystals in a little bit. And I made some more of those epoxy boards. Those are the higher tier ones that require the fiber reinforcement, either, well, carbon or glass, I guess. Okay, the moon also contains stuff like quartz, which is really nice, but the other crazy vein has dilithium, which is going to be insanely important for a lot of stuff later, and black quartz. Black quartz can be made a couple of different ways. I found it mostly in dungeon chests, which is really nice, but it's also convenient to be able to mine it if you somehow need it. I didn't need that much of it, which was pretty nice. But yeah, dilithium, that's what I was looking for. Up until now, I haven't been using too much of deep mob learning. I've pretty much only been creating resources when I needed them. However, I'm going to need a ton of resources later on. This is not the finished setup. I'm gonna work on that a bit later, but it's the beginning of it. Essentially, I'm using these item conduits to input the clay into the top and get the stuff out of the bottom. Long story short, this mod does not like applied Engergistics, or many things really. These item conduits are the only thing I found that actually works besides hoppers, and it has to be on the top and bottom, because of course it does. Anyways, you might notice something a little odd compared to like a standard playthrough, and this deep mob learning has like really bad rates for the pristine data. I have a problem with that. I think it's just stupid how much like clay and also power that you have to throw into these things. Considering the clay is very expensive as well, yeah, I'm not a huge fan of that. So I may have tweaked the settings a tiny bit. I forgot what the rates are, but they're so painfully low. I think it's like 5, 10, 20 or something like that, or 5, 10, 20, 30. That is really bad. 30% after thousands of iterations at max tier. I think that's dumb. So I changed it to be 10, 20, 50, and 70. I think those rates are far more fair than what is the default. But of course, that's just my play style. Everyone sees balance, or I guess balances things differently depending on their preferences. And yeah, I think the current balance was horrible. So you know what I was saying about on demand a bit earlier? That's the exact same system I'm building here, but it's kind of genius. Now, this isn't the final design, but in a little bit, I'm going to place a chest underneath all of these. It's just a single item chest, and essentially what it will do is the interface will export the items when it needs to craft something, and that item will go into the, well, loot fabricator and make the thing. I need that buffer because the interface doesn't like the item pipes, but that and this design is one of the reasons I love applied Engergistics, and it's so powerful. I understand it now. Essentially, with the pattern crafting, essentially all it's doing, unless it's like a shaped recipe that's making in the assemblers, it pretty much exports the items that are in the pattern, and it just expects the item in the output back. It doesn't care how that item is made, and that's the best part. You can do some really cool stuff with this whole setup. Like later on, I'm gonna make a setup that automatically cools down all of my hot ingots, so I don't need two different recipes. There's just one like dust to ingot recipe, and well, automation does the rest. Really neat system now that I know how it works. And in case you were wondering what I've been working on, why do I need all of this thermal mob data? Well, guess what? Automated nether star. And no, I'm not kidding. Automated nether stars. This is a pretty important part of the mod pack because we can't spawn withers, and the wither data gives us garbage. Technically endgame garbage, but garbage I won't even be using. All that really matters now is that I have all of the parts of the nether star automated. It's all the thermal expansion, blaze, things. It also requires an unholy amount of quartz, which is actually going to be quite a problem later on. The real solution to this, well, unfortunately, I think it's mass producing glass and electrolyzing that into quartz. That's what I did at the very end. I mostly relied on quartz dust that I got from mining quartz ore. Still, no good solution for quartz, which is very unfortunate. It's one of the few things you can't get out of mob data, which really sucks. But for how easy it is to make a nether star, it's hard to complain. And I am going to need thousands of nether stars throughout the playthrough. It's gonna get crazy. You know, now that I think about this setup, it looks even more stupid than it is, because I legitimately could have just used some HV power hatches and put them together. 2 hatches pulls 4 amps, which equals EV power. Well, that's dumb of me. Anyways, the other awesome thing that all of those blaze resources can produce is mana. Mana is, well, very useful for all sorts of stuff, including making these mana-infused ingots, which also requires titanium. A little bit annoying, but it's used to make these. It's used for the signalum and lumium and endurium recipes later on, so kind of important. These mana ingots, though, don't have many uses. They're primarily for some of the thermal expansion machines. That's literally what's been blocking me from making any of them up to this point. The aqueous accumulator is now an infinite water source, requires no water around it, and it's like instant, which is very neat. A lot of the other buildings I have no interest in because I'm not going too much with this mod, but the compactor is very nice because it compacts certain things that the Gregtech compactor won't do, and the gear working die will let me make certain gears way easier than, well, having to liquefy all the metal and then solidifying it. Now that I have more resources, one of the things I want to make to store, well, power for getting higher tier infrastructure is lapatronic crystals. These things are quite expensive because they require Engergium dust, which is a combination of redstone and ruby. That can get quite expensive. Now that I think about it, I guess you could just centrifuge redstone, get a tiny bit of ruby out of that, but I just straight up mine tons of rubies because I can. It also requires distilled water and an autoclave, not normal water. It's the only recipe that does this, by the way, so that's a little bit annoying. Besides that though, the lapitronic crystals require a bunch of lapis plates. Thankfully, it can be any of the lapis types, like sodalite or lazurite instead, which is nice. However, it also requires HV tier circuits, 2 per crystal. This gets very expensive very fast. Anyways, while that's all processing, I started to work on some of the thermal expansion machinery. Like I was saying earlier, I want to make a compactor with a gear die. The problem is actually getting the augment, it's called, because I need a diamond gear. The stupid thing is that the compactor would make the diamond gear infinitely better and cheaper, but no, I can't have nice things, so I had to make it myself. This cost 6 diamonds instead of 4, by the way. But whatever, one of the most useful buildings I now have. Lapitron crystals are going to be insanely important throughout this run for all sorts of stuff, really, but they're mostly used in power storage. They are still very expensive, trust me, but I have most of the stuff for them automated at this point, including circuits. I have actually automated those a while ago. Anyways, they're only EV tier power storage, so I won't actually be using them for that. Instead, I have to throw them in a laser engraver with a blue lens to get engraved laptronic crystals. These are used as a crafting item for several different recipes. You see, my goal here, I know it's a bit confusing because of the gameplay, but when I was playing, my plan was actually to tier skip through EV. You see, I only made a limited batch of titanium, and thankfully that kind of served me until the end of the game. And you don't really need that much titanium, it's all used in EV. Kind of like how stainless steel is all used in HV, so I wanted to go all the way up to IV, because I could. Tungsten steel is actually a bit cheaper and easier for me to make than titanium, oddly enough. That's why I need all of these lapitronic crystals so that I can actually make lapitron energy orbs, which are painfully expensive. They require stuff like platinum wire, nano CPUs, and of course a lot of these very expensive lapitron crystals themselves. So I did all of that for a while, but I also decided to remodel my base a little bit. I used a lot of that terracotta from these buildings' walls. I dug out a 3x3 chunk area, which is actually the size of my base, and it looks pretty good and clean, except for the vines. Like I said, whoever added this mod, actually no, whoever created it in the first place is a psychopath. They need to be locked in a mental asylum for the rest of their lives. This is not a good mod. I'm pretty sure I mentioned this stuff earlier in the video. Clathrate? Is that what it's called? Anyways, this is the stuff that requires like glowstone liquefied and ender pearls liquefied. There's also redstone one and quartz to get this stuff. It's used for crafting these blends like lumium, signalum, and endurium. The problem with these blends, like, they're not even expensive. All the resources are relatively easy to make for it. The problem is that, well, it takes hours to process this stuff. I'm not even kidding, because the recipes for this is, you know, like 600 seconds per. That's at a slightly lower tier, sure, but even, you know, with the overclock bonus of higher tiers, that's still several minutes per ingot. It is painfully slow. That's why they want you to build, you know, a ton of different blast furnaces. That is one slight problem, but whatever, I can just go AFK during dinner and whatever, and it'll be running. The whole reason I need lumium is not because it's required for this tier. I think it's actually like LUV, which is after IV. I think that's what requires it for all the machine holes. However, I need it to make wires, both the cables, the RF cables specifically, and the lumium wires to transport Gregtech EU power. I set up a little reactor there behind me, and it does have cooling in it. I'll get to that in a minute, but the first thing I'm going to be powering with it is actually a bunch of thermal centrifuges. These things are going to be working non-stop for hours to process the thousands of thorium and uranium dust I have in storage. That's so that I can start using the fuel to, well, fuel my reactors. You kind of get the point. Anyways, it's around this point in the playthrough that I finally decided to just go ahead and disable heat on reactors entirely. Getting power is going to be so annoying, and making all of the cooling cells and then designing the reactor properly, it's just a giant pain in the butt. Even with heat at like 0.001 or 0.01, yeah, that's the lowest it can go, 1%, it's still way too much. So I'm not going to be dealing with that mechanic anymore. I just want to see how much, power I can get out of a reactor. This is also nice because it allows me to put a ton of cells in moderator blocks together, which would normally create tons of heat, but with no heat, yeah, it's going to make the reactors super powerful and super efficient, which is very nice. And it's finally time to upgrade my blast furnace coils yet again. These are naturally more expensive because I require HSSG, which is high-speed steel G, I guess. This stuff requires a ton of tungsten steel, which actually has to be not only processed into ingots, but then ground back down into a powder. Fun. Well, considering you can't make the powder by mixing in this pack, I'm used to Gregtech where you can actually make the powder first. No, it has to be alloyed with steel and tungsten in this pack. Anyways, combining it with some other rare materials including vanadium, yeah, I get this stuff and it's going to take a while to process into ingots, which I obviously then have to cool. Turning those into wires allows me to get a nice little array of blast furnaces. This is going to be used for quite a while actually. One of the few things I'm going to be automating is annealed copper. I need some red alloy as well, but annealed copper is going to be needed in the millions. I'm not even kidding, because like the later we go, stuff like motors requires even larger annealed copper wires. There's stuff that takes, like 4, 8, 16 times wires. It's gonna get ridiculous. That's why I had to set up a proper version of my item factory, I guess I'll call it, the deep mob learning setup, and these are all going to go into drawers. Now, the stupid thing I kind of did for this setup, I have them all on storage buses. I literally forgot that storage controllers exist, so I don't need all of these storage buses. I only needed one. Whatever, they'll come in handy later on. Way earlier, you guys saw my insane looking oil setup. This is version 2. Infinitely more insane. What's even crazier is that I've learned how to combine, or wall share I guess, all of the distillation towers. The main issue is actually just the solid outputs, so as long as you have one solid output and they're both on the outside instead, then it's way easier. This system sucks, I have to admit. There are a trillion issues with it, and the main one is that the fluids in these pipes, the conduits, do not play well together. So even though it's sorted where it should only put like specific fluids into specific mixers or whatever, well, hydrogen gets in the system sometimes and messes stuff up. It's horrible. I should have just done this with applied Engergistics purely instead, because this part of my base is now on what's known as a subnet. So it's not on the main network, it's actually got its own little drive bay there with a bunch of fluid drives, but it's connected to the power and resources of the main network so that I can still import stuff like Steam really easily. So, what is this abomination of a setup gonna be used for? Well, trust me, when we look below, it's gonna get infinitely worse than it is up here. But long story short, this entire setup is made to create all sorts of gas products that I'm going to be using later, partially for fuel, we'll get to that, but the main thing I actually want from all of this, it's actually naphtha that I want. Believe it or not, naphtha. Normally this stuff is pretty useless, however in this pack it is pretty much essential. Actually, it might be in New Horizons as well, but naphtha is required to make epoxy. And I'm going to need a lot of epoxy resin for, well, all of the thousands of boards I'm going to need later on. So I thought I might as well set it up at least relatively early. And over the long term, I'm actually going to be cracking even all of the light and heavy fuel I get right into, well, steam cracked versions that will go into Distillation Tower. And guess what? Make me more naphtha. It's going to be like nothing but naphtha. Sure, I get all the other gas byproducts, but I'll just use those as fuel or turn them into more hydrogen later on. I'll be honest, It's best that you guys don't look at this setup too closely. It is absolutely the worst one I've ever made in any video game. It's the stuff of nightmares. But yeah, this whole mess of a setup is used to create all of my boards. It's pretty bad, let me tell you. It's a horrible combination of spaghetti, including pipes of all sorts. Well, not really pipes, it's mostly ME conduits, but power wires, including different voltage tiers, which you don't want to get mixed up. Thankfully, like you already know, machines don't explode in this pack, but still, you don't want to combine them because they'll burn up. But essentially, I have a lot of IV tier machines, some EV tiers because I felt like it. The wires that supply this thing are actually made out of platinum. They only have a loss of 1, and that's because I didn't want to use lumium wires. They're very expensive. I'm not going to explain this setup any further. It makes the epoxy resin, and I've stopped questioning it at this point. I've got the canola farm going, and it just works. Yeah, let's leave it there. It works. After all this time, I finally decided to start working on some things that are actually important to progression. This is one of the most fascinating parts of this mod pack, and it's all of the microverse, well, system. That's the whole mechanic. Essentially, you have to make all of these tiny ships and then supply them with various resources to get certain things in return. You can see all of the ships and resources I'm going to need in the top right there. I'm currently working on making moonstones. This pack doesn't have the division sigil, which is perfectly fine because that's annoying to activate anyways. And instead we can just straight up make the unstable ingots using a diamond, iron, and a stick. Very odd and ridiculously cheap, but whatever, it will still explode, so you have to handle them quickly. I'm decent enough at that. I need to make these so that I can create something called ethereal glass. That's literally required for the multi-block buildings that will, I guess, do the microverse missions. These are the microverse projectors, and they come in 3 sizes: small, medium, and large. For now, I'm only going to need the small one, but I will have to make the other ones later on. It's going to be a long time before those though, because man, they are expensive. Not just the projectors themselves, it requires a lot of the ingots, which require, energetic dust, steel, and deuterium. That's the most expensive part. But the ships that you actually need to make to get the resources, unfortunately, they're only single use, which is one of my biggest issues with this pack, definitely. But they are insanely expensive on top of that. So I'll be back in a little bit. As you can probably guess, all of the parts for these micro miners, as they're called, are insanely complicated and expensive to make. However, it is possible to automate everything through the wonders of applied Engergistics. The coolest part is that you can actually automate those large extended crafting tables, but you need specialized parts for that. I didn't do it for this one because it looked really scary and confusing. It's actually not that bad once you set it up. It's actually super straightforward, but I'll get to that later on. It just took a while to get all of the random resources I need for this thing, which, yeah, you can see all the various parts there. But this allows me to make a tier 2 micro miner. I made a tier 1 way earlier, which is super cheap, but it has 0 uses, for me at least. The one use I had for it, I can't even do yet because I can't make one of the parts for it. It's like a gemstone sensor, but I think I need an IV sensor for it, and that requires osmium, but for some reason I can't make it right now. I don't remember why. Anyways, the tier 2 miner is going to be a huge leap in progression for me. Why? That's because one of the resources it produces. It generates a bunch of different ores, most of which I won't be using, like scheelite. Well, I guess that could be useful, refined into tungsten later on, whatever. All I'm really here for, the biggest one, radon salt. This radon salt contains, you can probably tell, radon, and I have to throw that into an electrolyzer to actually get the gas. This radon has all sorts of insanely good uses. For example, I can start making quantum eyes and, well, later on quantum stars. Those aren't used as often, but I need the quantum eyes to make the next tier of CPU. Unfortunately, I only get 2 stacks of radon, aka 128, per operation, and I'm going to need a lot more than that throughout the entire run. combining the already insanely expensive nano CPUs with quantum eyes and gallium arsenide. This is getting ridiculous. I get qubit CPUs. This is the last tier of CPU, and it's going to be used for a lot of things. Last tier standard CPU at least. I'm going to be making some crystal processors later on. Those require emerald plates, exquisite emeralds, which you can only get from the microverse, of course, but it's not that horrible. You get a ton of them at a time. But of course, that's going to be for way later on. Some of the noble gases I got earlier, like helium and argon, are coming in handy again for some various recipes. For example, right now I'm making a ton of osmium and iridium. I think it's actually the iridium that takes like forever to process in the blast furnace, but the osmium is insanely fast. I can combine these to make osmiridium, which is an important alloy for all sorts of stuff later, including one of the components I need for auto-crafting those giant crafting recipes. So that's why I'm working on it all. The medium tier of multiverse projector is a tiny bit more difficult to make, but not really. It requires pretty much all the same components as the small one, just a few more, and it requires these blocks. I know it looks like obsidian, but it's actually diamond, but chiseled. So you have to chisel a very specific diamond block to build these things. That's definitely a first. I've never seen chisel blocks used in a multi-block before, but it is certainly very cool. So how does the extended crafting work? Well, automatically. There's an additional mod called Packaged Auto that handles all of this, and it's really neat how it does it actually. So you have a system very similar to Applied Engergistics where you've got a crafting interface and you can paste all of the recipes on there. You can choose your preset from one of the extended crafting table sizes, or you can have it just like blank, so you can do some really interesting stuff with this otherwise. Like I said earlier, all it does is supply the components. It doesn't care how it gets the output. But for these massive micro miner recipes, it actually puts them into multiple packages. So a single package can only contain 9 different items, or 9 stacks of items, if you will. And this essentially splits these into different, well, packages. So if you have a recipe that requires 10 or more items, then it'll split it into 2 separate packages. One that has 9, and then the second will have whatever remains. Really cool system. And for the next microverse trip that I'm planning, I require solidified argon. To solidify pretty much any of these gas resources, you just need a fluid solidifier and a ball mold, which is easy enough. Just wanted to note that because I'll need a lot of these near the end. Man, it is so nice to just be able to look at my giant crafting CPU and watch everything happen in real time. Everything is just automated. That's the beauty of it. I don't have to do any of this work myself anymore. The game, or I guess all the machines, are doing it. And yes, this does mean that I've learned to automate micro miners. That's essential for the rest of this mod pack. For now, I'm working on a tier 3. Now that I have all of the resources from previous missions, including osmium, that's kind of been my major bottleneck up to this point, I can actually use my tier 3 miner to get some really awesome resources, including those exquisite emeralds and exquisite diamonds. There's also ruby. I think the exquisite rubies are useless, except I can grind them down into tons of ruby dust, which I'll obviously be doing since I want more Lapitron crystals for later. Still, that's a pretty awesome haul right there. Literally right after that, I automated all the parts for and managed to get myself a tier 4 micro miner. This has pretty much one decent recipe I want. It has a bunch of iridium and osmium, which, yeah, I still have like no osmium. I want more of it. One thing I haven't really mentioned so far is that a lot of these missions require data. The data is extremely easy to get, actually. There are a few ways to do it, but for a while I had the Ender mob data going, and that can create something called Impossible Realm data. The Impossible Realm data can then be crafted with all sorts of other things, like the Nether and End chunks that you get from the deep mob learning, and that's how you get other types of data. And these are used as inputs for other missions. Like this tier 4, for example, it requires wither data. Have I mentioned that I don't know how many hundreds of hours I am in at this point, I've still been using the exact same tier 2 jetpack that I had from the very start. Like, I crafted that thing so early on, I just haven't bothered to upgrade because I'm so used to this one. I don't really use the hover, I have the grappling hook for that. And yes, it's still the same grappling hook. I actually upgraded it to diamond, which has better range and speed. The next upgrades are either redstone, which gives you like creative flight in a radius around it, and the ender one, which I don't know if it teleports you right to the target, but I think it has super fast speed. Anyways, flight upgrade, always useful. Next up, a very important building that I'm making. Actually, a couple of them from Ender.io. These are all of the like soul things I'm going to need. I haven't made the splice and slice yet, that's a tiny bit later on. I think that requires the extended crafting tables, I'm pretty sure. The soul binder is a bit easier though. Anyways, making the XP pylon is pretty important because this allows me to store a lot of XP. As you can see, I've actually been storing some up. I was exporting the overworld matter into a Ender.io tank, which automatically converts it into experience. That experience is now in liquid form, but I can throw that into the XP pylon, which can store it as a liquid, or you can retrieve it as like player XP, which is really nice. Anyways, this liquid XP is necessary to automate the soul binder. The soul binder has a ton of uses, and it's going to be critical for late game materials, like all of these specialized crystals that I need. And yes, these crystals that require shulker souls. Yeah, it's not even that bad. It sounds horrible. All you need is shulker shells and a soul jar. You can automatically craft these, which is very nice. But yeah, these gems are gonna suck because you need a lot of them for like some of the last tiers of circuits. It's gonna get insane, trust me. Since I was working on some of the jetpacks earlier, might as well go all the way and get myself an angel ring. However, for the angel ring, you not only need both types of jetpacks, because there's like simply jetpack. Actually, I think the mod contains both recipes from Ender.io and thermal expansion, but you actually need 2 of both types, which really sucks to make. I really don't feel like doing that. So I just decided I've managed to make 1 of each. And since I don't want to autocraft like every single recipe for this thing, I'm just gonna spawn in the other 2 I need. I mean, I'm close enough at this point, and well, you'll see, I want to save time on this run. It's taken long enough as is. Besides that, it just requires some rose gold, which is easy enough. Gold dust, copper dust. I could have made that for years at this point, but I did not automate the recipe because, like, you don't need more than like 1 of these even, I think. So I had to go fish out my old extended crafting table. You know, one of the coolest parts about the extended crafting is that the tables can just be put in the crafting menu and duplicated for free. This is just to make it so you can get the automated ones really easy and cheap instead of having to waste tons of extra resources. It's really nice. The only slight problem I noticed is that I barely have the grid power for this thing. So eventually I did actually make a dragon egg generator that gives like 500 grid power, which is definitely overkill. By default, the angel ring just shows like nothing. It gives you creative flight, but there are options for customization. You can get like special types of wings. However, the one I was looking at uses purple and pink dye, and it looks like butterfly wings. Well, guess what it just happens to be? Butterfly wings. It's absolutely perfect. For a tiny bit of context, because I know maybe 1 out of a billion people will understand this, this skin is one I made myself, and it's based off the character Chouko from Arc Recode. As you can see, she's got butterfly wings, and that's why I wanted this specific wing type. I think it looks very pretty. I think the main thing holding me back from making the slice and splice for a long time was actually the tungsten steel. I haven't had a use for this thing until now, by the way, and I was just playing around trying to figure out what capacitor was pretty decent. Again, most of these dungeon capacitors suck. Unless you get like a perfect one, then it's close to a tier 4 or tier 5 capacitor. Even though the double compressed capacitor is very expensive, it's definitely worth it for these machines since I will be using them in the end game. And like most of the time as well. I need the parts they create for a lot of recipes. After a very long time, I decided to process a ton of sphalerite and galena. These two ores, if you guys have seen my last video, Gregtech New Horizons, which is currently episode 9 before I made this video, one of the last things I did in there was make indium. And, well, it's the same exact process here. Same ores, same everything, really. But unlike New Horizons, I'm just gonna throw away all of the lead zinc solution you get out of this process. I could recycle it, sure, but I don't really need any of the resources inside of it. The water is infinite, and all the other stuff is just junk, really. The indium is literally all I care about here. The main expense in this process is actually, well, kind of sulfuric acid, but I can get sulfur from creeper mob data, and the aluminum. Aluminum, thankfully, can be acquired from Guardian mob data, which is very nice. Do you guys ever have one of those moments where you're stuck on some problem for hours, and when you finally realize it, it's the smallest mistake and you feel like a massive idiot? Well, this was that moment for me. So in this pack, another way to get power is turbines. There are several types of turbine generators, well, 3, I guess. You've got steam, which feels really difficult to scale up, gas turbines, which, okay, makes sense, I've got plenty of gas fuels, and diesel turbines, which burns, you know, diesel and nitro diesel, stuff like that, the heavier fuels. Long story short, they have their own specialized casings. You can't just use standard clean stainless. It has to be a special alloy with stainless steel. And once I figured that out, yeah, it finally works. After hours of trying to get this stupid system to work, there we go. So this is another really good mid-game option. At least I think the gas and diesel has some use, especially with a good oil setup. The end game one is a plasma generator, but I won't be able to use that for quite a while. So this all means that while solar panel spam is technically the best option, there is at least some alternatives in this pack. In Gregtech New Horizons, I know that nuclear power, fission, not fusion, can carry you like super far into the late tiers, which is very nice. I'm not 100% sure what my endgame fuel sources are going to be, but I really like the nuclear system so far. I've been spending a ton of time working on this. Not the reactor, of course, that's just for power, the assembly line. The assembly line is actually something I'm getting close to in my New Horizons playthrough as well, and it's very similar in this pack. Of course, you've got to build it in a very specific way. You need a lot of, I'm talking like hundreds of circuits. Thankfully, they're like tier 5 and 6. I think those are the main ones you use. But still, this thing is insanely expensive to make. I cannot stress that enough. But the assembly line is required to make pretty much everything from here on out. Well, I'm mostly talking about machine components for LUV+. The assembly line also has to be in like a very specific, build pattern. On top of that, you need like a specific length depending on what you're making. Now, thankfully, this pack isn't as bad as New Horizons, where I've seen videos. I know for a fact in New Horizons, the assembly line is like hell to deal with. That's why I'm terrified of it. But thankfully, Applied Engergistics is a bit more advanced in there to make automating the assembly line a bit easier. In here, Applied Engergistics isn't as great, but I still managed to make do. Essentially, how the assembly line works is that it has a ton of inputs at the bottom and one output. You also need liquid inputs, but thankfully you can mix and match all the liquids, so I don't have to worry about that. Anyways, I'm using an Applied Engergistics setup here, of course with a subnet. Essentially how this works is I have two interfaces touching each other. The interface connected to my main network has the recipe in it. Whenever I request this recipe, it's going to put all of the items into the subnet. The subnet has a lot of storage buses connected to all of the inputs. Now, I did configure this one in order so that it tries to put items, in the first slot first, second, and so on. Thankfully, the order does not matter in this pack, which is very nice, especially considering some parts, like pumps and pistons, actually require a circuit, a number circuit like 1 or 2 to make them. So you can set up assembly lines for those individually, which is pretty nice, but I'm really just surprised that this whole system actually worked first time. I could not believe it. I swapped the other interface for a storage bus, which broke the system, meaning that yes, I did in fact do it right the first time. Nothing insanely interesting has been happening for quite a while. I guess that sums up this run pretty well. It's mostly just me automating stuff, but I wanted to note this part because it's insane. The ME interfaces can hold, what is that, like 36 patterns, I think, recipes. The wild thing is that I have a full one of these on my other compressor, so that's at least 36 recipes of things I need to compress, not counting all the other ones in the thermal expansion compressor and gear compressor. This is getting ridiculous. Anyways, now I've finally managed to make the tier 5 micro miner. Why is this thing so important? Well, take a look at the recipes. The first one contains some decent ores, but I'm not insanely interested in it. It's the second recipe that is going to change everything. In a little bit though, because this recipe also requires stabilized plutonium. I had to make some stabilized curium as well. I haven't really mentioned that, but all you do is melt down your curium or plutonium from Nuclearcraft, and then you use the ball mold to solidify it. I also needed these 2 specific alloys to make something called Cenarium. That's how you make it in this pack, and it takes like 100 seconds per operation at IV. It's ridiculous. Back to the tier 5 miner though. The reason this is game changing is because of the second recipe. It gives me 4 stacks of Nikeda dust. This stuff, unfortunately, it's not real. It's, your classic sci-fi material, but it is insanely important to my progression. I have been waiting for this stuff for hours, literally hundreds of hours since I first saw it at this point. Why is this material so game-changing? First of all, it allows me to make my next 2 tiers of coils for the blast furnace, but it also allows me to make the final tier of Boole, which is Nikeda doped. Now, why is that so important? Well, Nikeda doped wafers can be used to make System on a Chip, SoC, and Advanced System on a Chip. Those are the final circuits I need, or the final chips, I guess, and they will make a lot of the chip recipes infinitely cheaper, which obviously I've been waiting for hundreds of hours at this point. It's been one of my main goals. So this is insanely exciting to finally get some crazy progress. Oh, and have I even mentioned the cost of the Nikeda Booles? It takes blocks of silicone. Not just silicone dust, that's what the first 2 tiers of Boole take. No, it's full on silicone blocks, Nikeda ingots, and argon. Argon was also used in the tier 2 recipe, so I'm used to it, but still, that is ridiculous. On top of that, I actually need a higher tier laser engraver. You can technically do the system on chip in EV, it's not that bad, but you also need a draconium lens to do the advanced one. The basic system on chip is only a nether star lens, which sounds expensive, but as you guys know, I've automated that a long time ago. And at this point, I'm regularly using them. And at this point, I'm regularly using all of the items in the nether star recipe to make mana, which has a kind of similar recipe. I've automated mana and cryothium. Well, at least I did at some point, because those will come in handy for all sorts of crafting recipes. One of the biggest problems I've been facing in crafting for quite a while now has been when, for example, my ore processing creates thousands of tiny dust that clog up my nice, neat, and storage system. I assure you, it's not nice and neat at all. It's an absolute mess. But I just create more drives to solve my storage issues. Anyways, to deal with the tiny dust issue, I am making this awesome building. The processing array is unique to this mod pack, and it essentially takes the place of, well, every other multi-block in Gregtech New Horizons. This allows you to put a bunch of machines inside of it. For example, and pretty much how it works is it only contains one machine type, think like a packager, for example, in this case. But you can have a ton of these machines and essentially parallel to get a lot of processing really fast, which is nice. Of course, you still have to worry about power. You can't draw more power than your processing array can take in. So if you have like one IV machine, you can technically have two since the hatches can draw 2 amps. But if you have more than that, you have to be careful of your amperage or the machine will just infinitely stall. I'll show you guys a better example of this machine a bit later on with like pulverizers and centrifuges, but for now, I made this very simple one with a packager inside of it. Okay, it's not the most efficient use of a packager, I will admit, it's probably one of the dumbest, but here's my logic. You see, a packager can only contain 2 items, and one of those has to be a circuit to tell the thing how to like transform the dust, either from tiny pieces into a full solid one, or from a solid into small or tiny, alright? But the main benefit of the multi-block machine is the ability to choose the hatches, aka input and output. And as you can see, I went for a LUV tier hatch, which gives me a ton of storage space. I hope you guys are seeing what I'm thinking right now. With a bigger hatch, I can store more dust in there, so all of the various dusts, which there are dozens of, I can just throw in there and the tiny bits will be, well, packed into their standard sizes. This allows me to save a lot of time and effort, especially on my part, having to compress all of them manually, and yeah, completely automates it. This is definitely one of my best ideas in the entire run, and it absolutely paid off. Not to mention, it doesn't actually stop at like dust either, because it can also be used, perfect example here is for Nuclearcraft. When I centrifuge the depleted fuels to get the more radioactive materials that I'll use to make the higher tier fuels, well, guess what? That creates a ton of tiny bits that I have to, well, craft manually. This packager now takes that job and does it automatically, so I don't have to worry about it. It's awesome. I'm working in the last corner of my base that was clear before, and yes, there is another reactor here. I have 5 mini reactors in total. I say mini, but the 2 on the current left that you're looking at, those are pretty big and supply a ton of power because all of those places need it. Anyways, this entire setup is dedicated to making all of the chemicals I need. This first one is actually styrene butadiene? I think that's what it's called. And this is a rubber. It's kind of like the tier 2 rubber in between, well, standard rubber and silicone rubber. The whole reason I skipped it is because I didn't need it. Unfortunately, I need it now. It's a little bit annoying because I have the highest tier 1 automated already, but okay. And I have to rebuild that setup here now, but whatever. On top of that, I'm making some sulfuric acid because I'm constantly out of that. On top of that, I'm making a mixer for lubricant. I got a ton of creosote oil from wood distilling earlier on, so I put that into a mixer with redstone and then, of course, storage bus it. Same thing here, I'm making a fluid extractor for soldering alloy, and if you couldn't tell, all of these are going to be resources needed in the various assembly lines that I'm going to have to produce. You need, like, soldering alloy is the biggest one, you need a tiny bit of lubricant, some rubber, and water for like a couple specific ones. We'll get to the last resource I need for assembly lines very soon, trust me. After a while of crafting, I finally managed to make an LUV assembly machine. The crazy thing about this is that I needed to make ZPM tier circuits. There are, I believe, 3 more tiers of circuits that I'm missing past this. LUV is tier 6, which, oh dear, means I had to make tier 7 circuits to actually make this assembler. There are, okay, if those are tier 7, there's tier 8, which is UV, and then tier 9, I don't actually remember the corresponding tier, but that is the final circuit we're going to be making. Who knows when that's going to happen though. This is still a great step in the right direction because, well, cheaper circuits, you know the drill. The final chemical I have completely forgotten about at this point, also one of the most expensive, is PTFE, polytetrafluoroethylene. I think that's it. It requires a lot of different chemicals, thankfully I have them. but it does require fluorine, which kind of sucks because it's a little rare. Thankfully, bastonite, I think, is like CeFO, so it's got fluorine in it. I think that's where I got a lot of mine from. So not bad overall. Oh, and in case you were wondering, the PTFE is required to make, I believe, the last 2 or 3 tiers of hulls. Yeah, ZPM and UV hulls it's required for instead of polyethylene, so I had to make it at some point. Do you guys remember that little stack of chickens that I've had for a very long time now? Well, it's time to finally put them to some use. You see, I've had a plan for, well, ever at this point, and I made this little contraption. It automatically uses eggs to spawn the chickens, and with those little egg blocks there, those are actually mob filters, specifically age. Because, you know, these are baby chickens. When they grow into adults, they'll fall down onto the spike right there. Okay, it sounds horrible, and it is. After thinking about it for a while, I'm pretty sure the intended way to get a ton of animal meat is by using a powered spawner, which, okay, yeah, I see that's definitely a smart way to do it now. But whatever, I wanted to do this because I thought it would be hilarious. The main issue is that I never automated this setup. Again, thinking about it now, I could probably just have used a timer. I don't want to spawn them too fast or else they'll entity cram and die before they grow up and can produce meat, but I just wanted to note that because it's going to come in handy later on. The processing array comes in very handy, but yet again. This time, I'm going to fill it with a bunch of thermal centrifuges. Thermal centrifuges mostly have one use, that's for processing nuclear fuel, either returning crafted nuclear fuel to its base components. The centrifuge is only used when your fuel is depleted, but if you want to like recycle fuel that you haven't used yet, you get the point. But its primary purpose is still for turning uranium and thorium dust into their respective Nuclearcraft counterparts. And that's what they'll be doing for a while because I just processed a ton of uranium-238. For my next project, I made the vat from Ender.io. I haven't needed this thing like up until now in the run. The only reason I maybe would have wanted it before is if I went for the Ender.io teleportation to get, well, to the moon and back constantly, but the draconic evolution is just easier. Fun fact, I've never actually worked with the vat before. I understand the recipes, I just don't know exactly how everything works. Well, apparently the multiplier stands for how much of a resource it actually consumes instead of makes. So it consumes like way more potatoes, or I guess water, instead. So if I had something with a lower modifier, then it would consume less water, which isn't a huge issue, I just didn't understand it at the time. Anyways, I'm making a resource called hooch. This hooch is a combination of some sort of fermenter and sugar. Makes a lot of sense. I'm pretty sure it's some sort of like alcoholic type thing, like mead, maybe? Whatever. All that matters is that I needed to make fire water with blaze powder and redstone next. Another fun fact, I've known about Ender.io and I've seen it in tons of packs, but I've never gotten this far, like, with it. I've never used fire water before. So apparently it doesn't have to be source blocks, it just has to be spread out on top of bedrock. But fire water has a chance, you know, every tick to spawn dust or grains of infinity. The grains of infinity are what I need right now. And again, I didn't know you could just have flowing water. I thought for sure it had to be source blocks. I guess not. The whole reason I need grains of infinity is for the next project I'm working on. On top of an unholy amount of infinity grains, I also need an insane amount of endstone dust to make end steel, which also requires, what, dark steel? It's gonna be a nightmare. The super funny thing about all of this is that technically, this is just a side project. It's not even necessary in the end because I can still either get deuterium from hydrogen, which now that I think about it, it's probably easier to automate and scale that up. But oh well, here we are. I wanted to make this thing. This is a lunar mining station. It can only be built on the moon, obviously, and it requires you to make very specific items, aka rovers. These things have like a 10% chance to be consumed on use, but they produce a ton of deuterium or helium-3 based on whatever type you use. This is also when I decided to set up some gas turbines because I thought they would be really fun. They are very neat, they just burn through fuel like crazy. Well, okay, I might have had my whole oil and wood setup off for a long time now. If I'd kept those going, then they'd probably be way more useful and last way longer. Also, I'm using HSSG-S. This is one of the best materials for rotors, besides, the pure endgame stuff, and it has 100% efficiency, on top of 300,000 durability, so really good choice for these things. And since you're all curious about how I'm getting applied Engergistics here, yes, I am using quantum rings, and no, they are not legit in the slightest. I didn't know you actually had to make the singularity in here. In creative testing, I had no problem, but I guess that makes sense. It gives you the free singularity in creative. Actually, well, the split singularity that you need for those. Even though I've been saying that circuits are getting cheaper, they are getting infinitely more expensive for the highest tier ones. I had to make another assembly line to accompany all of the components needed for this thing. You see, this requires more than 9 components, which I was talking about the whole packaging system earlier. I tried to get that to work, but it didn't in my testing. However, I had a better idea. Since you can easily customize the recipe in the applied Engergistics system, all I had to do was automatically, or export, I guess, all of the surface mount devices into the assembly line, so I don't have to worry about those. The recipe takes care of the rest of the items, which is really nice. But you can probably see how insane this recipe is from a couple of the items. Draconium plates, quantum eyes, crystals, I think those are like Pesians, I don't remember what those are, I think shulkers are required for those. Yeah, it's pretty insane. Realizing the major issue I've run into, I decided to completely rework my resource setup yet again so that I can generate every single resource in the game that I can, at least. All of the mob matters, all of the heads, believe it or not. Why would I need heads from mobs? Well, certain things like zombie heads, skeleton heads, enderman heads, those are required to make specific Ender IO items, and go figure, those Ender IO items are required to make the highest tiers of circuits, so of course I'm gonna have to automate those. On top of all of the blaze and alternative components I'm gonna need to make infinite mana, because yeah, nether stars are gonna be an issue very soon. It's getting pretty insane. Now that I have all the heads automated, it's time to actually automate the Ender IO machines. Since the interfaces don't play nice with these things, I actually have to use these storage drums, or any chest works really. You just can't open chests with a solid block above them. And this acts as a buffer so that the machines can actually get the resources. It didn't work for a little bit because I may have swapped up the recipes by accident, but once I realized that, it's time to start working on the next tier of miner. This one is, okay, obviously they get more expensive and painful as we go on, but this one was really bad because it required a lot of endurium, and that stuff takes forever to craft. Granted, I should have definitely made more blast furnaces that can handle it, but oh well. On top of that, it needed specialized lasers that required radon, and the annoying thing is there's only 2 chemical bath and 2 chemical reactor recipes that use radon. I have so little of it that's not really worth automating just yet. I had to overclock and upgrade my first assembly line so that I could make this, a CEF for ZPM, 0-point module. Because guess what, this recipe, well, it works in LUV, but it wasn't working for some reason. I also wanted it to go faster because look at that, it takes a full freaking minute. All of the Endurium miners recipes are very helpful, and I will be going for all of them at some point, but the first one I want actually has a ton of osmium, which is always useful considering I need a ton of that and it's very rare. Alright, here's where the fun truly begins. You guys remember those chickens from earlier? This is them now. Yep, mincemeat. So, funny story, I accidentally threw my raw chicken in a centrifuge instead of a pulverizer. In case you didn't know, the centrifuge turns it into methane, the pulverizer turns it into mincemeat, so remember your machines. Anyways, now that I have mincemeat, I can throw this in a mixer with distilled water, tiny pieces of salt, and sugar. The normal recipe, I don't actually remember what machine it uses, but it's distilled water and mincemeat. However, this recipe where you add sugar and salt gives you a way better ratio per single mincemeat, which is important because I don't make this stuff very fast and I'm going to need a lot of it throughout the playthrough, or at least the rest of the playthrough. This recipe produces something called raw growth medium. It's probably as disgusting as it sounds, considering it's a mixture of meat and water. To use this stuff, I actually have to sterilize it first, so it goes into a fluid heater, which is insanely fast. And that all gets dumped into a massive quantum tank. That's going to be my storage for this stuff. And I have an export bus that puts raw growth medium back into the fluid heater because some recipes that take sterilized growth medium do output raw. So this whole system, it's kind of like a loop and it works very well. Of course, most recipes just straight up consume the growth medium and don't give you any back, so it does get quite expensive. So, you're probably wondering what this abomination is actually used for. Growth medium is used in a bunch of recipes, but the first two are going to be, well, wetware circuits, but not 100% there yet. I need to make draconic stem cells, which require dragon eggs. Yeah, one dragon egg makes a stack, but at LUV tier, it takes 5 minutes. That's insane. Stem cells and my highest tier circuit boards currently also take 5 minutes to make a wetware board, but that's at IV, so it only takes, 2.5 minutes overclocked? Still, this is gonna be a while. Since we're on the topic of recipes that'll hurt your bones just thinking about them, the next one, and one of the most important things of the playthrough, superconductors. Now, up to this point, I have had lossless cables for all tiers, but to make the final superconductor that can transmit max voltage, I need draconic wires, or draconium wires. That's not difficult, but to turn them into superconductors, well, you see what I'm doing. It costs a single nether star per wire. That is just awful. I mean, yes, I can automate nether stars, but that doesn't make it feel any better to do. Like, I've just burnt through 4 stacks of nether stars. To make things worse, a lot of the recipes that use superconductors take ridiculous amounts of them. For example, I'm going to make superconductor coils for my blast furnace and many other things later on. And remember, a single coil takes 16 wires. 8 times 2. And then if I want to make a blast furnace out of these things, it takes 128. So that's 2 stacks of not only expensive draconium wire, which is 1 stack of the ingots, but it's 2 stacks of nether stars. Alright, but now just wait until later on when I need like 32 of these coils to make the fusion reactor, which obviously I have to do because it's required for some endgame resources and very useful otherwise. Ugh, this is gonna suck. Another very painful expenditure is finally upgrading my Nikeda blast furnace to Nikeda alloy. That's the one that requires osmiridium. This is required for a couple of recipes, including making dark solarium, which is a combination of dark steel and solarium ingots, and it requires tritium to produce. Tritium is actually derived from deuterium, I believe. You have to centrifuge it, and the recipe or ratio is like horrible. You get so little tritium from deuterium, so it is very painful, very fast. These dark solarium are required for a couple of endgame recipes though, so I'm gonna have to make them one way or another. Oh yeah, and apparently another way to die, turbines. So right-clicking the turbine access port when you're in survival is instant death if it's at high speed. The more you know. I really didn't expect that because it worked perfectly fine in creative, but yeah. I've still died dozens of times to accidentally running into live wires, by the way. That has never changed. After going AFK for several hours and waiting for this lumium to be produced, because yes, this is an LUV machine, I need like 100 or something LUV machine casings on top of all the superconducting coils that I need. It's just insane. I know this is the end game of a Minecraft mod pack, so it's naturally going to be ridiculous, but still. Because if you think about it, each one of these holes, or casings, thankfully they're not holes, those would be more expensive, requires 8 lumium ingots, so it's going to be well over 100 by the time I'm done with this. On top of the 32 superconductors that I was talking about earlier as well. This is not fun. Oh, and this is all not even considering the cost of actually making the fusion reactor block, like the controller for it. That is a whole nother story I am not ready for just yet. I wanted to build this thing because I had the materials for it. Thankfully, you can cheap out a tiny bit and you don't have to make all of the fluid input and output hatches. You only need like 2 or 4, but I will have to make all of the power hatches because the more power hatches you have, the better recipes you can make. Unfortunately, I'm only limited to 160 million energy units, which is still an insane amount, but it will increase over time. Unfortunately, this still means I can only make the most basic recipes. Completely unrelated project, but do you guys remember that toluene I made all the way at the beginning of the run? Well, it's finally time to use it. Gelled toluene and sulfuric acid mixed TNT. Very much like New Horizons, except I went for industrial TNT in there, so it was way more expensive, I think. Or maybe not. The gelled toluene in this pack is only solidifying the gas, but in New Horizons, I remember I need like sugar and polyethylene dust to make the gelled toluene. It's pretty insane. Anyways, this stuff is going to be used for an implosion compressor, which is necessary to make a bunch of like endgame plates and some stuff like omnium nuggets. But we'll get there in a while. Oh, and did I mention, to make some of the wetware circuits, I actually need a specialized assembly machine. Not an assembly line, but a dedicated assembly machine because this recipe does require sterilized growth medium instead of soldering alloy that all the other circuits made, so I had to make that as well. Pretty annoying. After a long while of collecting various random items that I need to make the fusion controller, I'm almost ready. There are a couple of odd recipes I've never seen before, like neutronium plating or whatever that stuff is called. It requires tin alloy, which I haven't had in a recipe for hundreds of hours at this point, and it's a liquid, so of course. Thankfully I have it automated because I did need it at some point. Beryllium plates, which have literally no other use. Beryllium itself is only good for plates and I guess moderator blocks for the reactors, but even that is pretty useless. On top of that, I'm pretty sure it requires a reinforced iridium ingot, which is one reason I needed the implosion compressor. To make that, it's a ton of iridium, tungsten, and something else. It was insane. And diamond dust. Which diamond dust isn't bad, obviously I have automated diamonds, but still, this is ridiculous. Of course, I will need these reinforced iridium for later on, so it's good to have them automated. And finally, I can make this insanely bizarre recipe. A fusion coil block, which is one of the things I had to craft that requires all those bizarre items. Wetware circuits, which are required for the fusion reactor, because why would I be able to use anything else? Nether star plate, extremely specific type of plutonium plate, superconductors, high power integrated circuits, LUV tier field generators. Just go figure it's going to be this insanely expensive at this point. Oh well, it's finally being crafted. With that, the fusion reactor Mark 1 is complete. Like I was saying earlier, this only unlocks a tiny fraction of all of the recipes, Okay, it's probably like a third if I really think about it. The other two are obviously locked behind the Mark II and Mark III fusion reactors because they can hold more power. We all get the point. Now, I was hoping to use a copy and paste gadget to copy and make another one of these extremely easy. Unfortunately, copy paste gadget absolutely sucks because it can't copy tile entities, which, go figure, is 99% of Gregtech blocks, cause of course they are. So I might as well just rebuild this myself. In creative, obviously, I'm not gonna pay for all of these insanely expensive blocks again. You see, I'm getting to the point in the run where I just want to complete the pack at this point. I'm kind of getting sick and tired of it, actually. So from here on, a lot of stuff will be cheated in once I have made it for the first time. You see, I kind of call this like proven capability. Like, I've shown you guys I have the ability to make all of this stuff. It just takes a very long time, and my time, not to mention patience, is starting to run thin. The fusion reactor is used to make all sorts of really cool and exotic materials, like tritanium and duranium later on. Unfortunately, those will require some more power. Actually, I think I can make tritanium right now. You can also make really neat stuff like tungsten and osmium and even radon later on. But for now, I'm gonna make a stupidly simple recipe. Using, I think it's helium-3? Yeah, and carbon, I can make oxygen plasma. It sounds really stupid, it kind of is, but oxygen plasma can be used as a very good fuel source in those plasma turbines. That's still a while off though. Before I can get to making super exotic materials, I mean, it's still a very neat resource, but I have to make something called europum. This requires neodymium, so I gotta fluid extract that first, and hydrogen. Those combine to make, europum. Europum then is thrown in a fluid solidifier to get ingots. Well, ingots for the quest. I'm going to be making plates later on, and those plates are required to make the next tier fusion reactor, and here's the insane part, those are required to make LUV tier power storage. I can essentially make ZPM power storage at this point, although that is infinitely more expensive, but still, I've had to wait this long before even getting a taste of LUV power storage. That's one thing I don't like about this pack. I think you should be able to get the orb clusters way earlier than this. Oh well, since I haven't been using any of my Nomi coins in this entire run, I added it up and I actually have around 75 Nomi dollars. That's pretty funny. But I decided to spend some of them to make tantalite ore. I'm gonna need tantalum for one of the next recipes. I'm gonna need tantalum for one of my fusion reactor recipes, and I don't know where to find this stuff. It's either so insanely rare I haven't found it yet, or it's in a dimension I haven't went to, like one of the planets. That is actually another thing you can do. There are more planets than just the moon. I really didn't feel like going to them, though. I'd rather do that in Gregtech New Horizons. You know, one of the true beauties of automation packs like this, when you have a certain issue, like for example, storage, you just automate it and it solves all of your problems. The storage problem that automation creates, it also solves, which I find hilarious. I also decided to make a bunch of processing arrays to deal with a bunch of the various ores that I have. The machines are all IV, but you can have a ton of IV machines as long as you have enough power. This line back here is thankfully LUV, which makes life a whole lot easier. And yes, the wires are still exposed in case you were wondering. If I want to get any decent amount of crafting done, I actually have to upgrade my crafting CPUs. I was talking about this way earlier, but I really didn't expect to need more than like 16K. Well, I guess I do now. 144K for that planned recipe. It's a bit ridiculous. As you can probably see, I am attempting to build more assembly lines, hence the insanely expensive crafting recipes. And every so often, the game will actually give you like an estimate in the crafting status, if it's smart enough. 15 minutes. Is ridiculous. It's probably way longer than that, but if you look at the recipe, it requires like 10,000 annealed copper. It's just mind-blowing how much stuff I need. And this isn't even like Gregtech New Horizons. I once heard someone say that you'll process like trillions of items by the end of that, so I'm kind of terrified to see how that goes. After a while, I managed to construct my Mark II fusion reactor. A lot of the parts are actually the same, really. The major difference is the coils on the inside are those fusion coils instead, and the outside of it requires LUV casing, of course, with tungsten steel. It's like 6 tungsten steel plates per, so yeah, that's a nightmare. Anyways, on one of my first reactors, I've been making duranium. This requires gallium and radon. Yes, radon. Extremely expensive and difficult to make. Thankfully, I can actually make radon. It's a fascinating combination of gold and mercury. However, it requires a higher tier fusion reactor, which is what I was waiting for. On top of that, I managed to craft a ton of Laptronic orb clusters, which requires like 8 Laptronic orbs. It's ridiculous, but that's LUV power storage. And technically, the capacity is 1 billion EU, which is 10 times that of a normal orb. It's finally time for me to start utilizing all that oxygen plasma I've been making. It actually consumed like all of the carbon that I had in my storage, which is a little concerning. As you can probably guess, this setup is not legit in the slightest because of how purely expensive this whole thing is, especially those rotors. I had the rotors automated for a tiny bit, but for this many, yeah, it's a bit too difficult. Anyway, each one of these turbines, if I remember correctly, they produce it's like 1.5 LUVs, I think. So that should be able to fill up a lot of power very fast, especially with how efficient oxygen plasma is. Those are going to be dumped into a ton of battery buffers. That's where I'm keeping all of my batteries. Kind of self-explanatory there. And this is going to be my endgame power source, because why not? The name I've decided for this massive power conduit, which is 16 times wires, by the way, that is 64 amps, pretty awesome, but I call it the Bug Zapper for obvious reason. Okay, well, partially because my skin is, based off of Chouko, she's got butterfly wings, and half because a bat flew in here at some point and got zapped by this thing. That was hilarious. Okay, but I also died to it several times as well. The other thing I'll be making with the Mark II fusion reactor is tritanium. This is a combination of duranium and titanium. I mean, it makes complete sense. The other thing I was originally planning to make with the Mark II fusion reactor is actually tungsten. You can make tungsten by combining tantalum, which is why I got it earlier. It literally has no other uses in this pack, and tritium. So that was the plan before the endgame kind of, unraveled. I just wanted to get it over with, Now that I'm getting closer to the endgame, it's time to really start working on some bizarre stuff I'm going to need to make the endgame materials. For example, I need, at least to complete all the missions, a stack of just about every resource in the game, including all sorts of solidified elements like radon, argon, xenon, all the gases, all the liquids, all that stuff. Okay, all of the periodic table elements. I hope that is a better way to explain it. That's for one part. For another part of what I need all sorts, it requires other bizarre materials. In this case, it's all of the, exotic materials is what it's called. So high-speed steel, vanadium steel, the dark solarium I was working on earlier, mana ingots of all sorts, manolian, which you have to make red steel, and then ardite, which I've had ardite for a while because I think that's needed for a recipe, or at least red steel is. It is certainly something. I think one of the most interesting ones was actually night slime, because that's a thing in this pack. It has no use except this one recipe. It requires liquid titanium and slime. And, a casual stack of crystalline matrix ingots. These things require an unholy amount of diamonds and nether stars. It's not even funny how expensive these things are. Oh, and the smaller matrices require the exquisite diamonds on top of it all. That's why you're supposed to automate the whole, microverse system so you can get more diamonds and stuff like that. It's getting exhausting at this point. However, after a lot of crafting, I can finally say I have omnium, or very close to it. Omnium motes create omnium nuggets. Obviously 9 nuggets to an ingot, so I don't really have many ingots. However, I have finally gotten one major part of the endgame completed, and it is very exciting. Naturally, there's even more stuff I have to set up to autocraft. In this case, I require a bunch of specialized buildings. These are essentially empowerers, but automated, which is actually super nice to be able to set them up this easily. I do like this system a whole lot, but it was very expensive and annoying to craft in of itself. However, this allows me to automate all of the empowered recipes. There are a bunch of them, but I'm just doing all of like the blocks, which require a ton of random stuff. I know there's like nitrogen, or maybe it's hydrogen gas. There are water cells. It requires gemstones like sapphires, rubies, and it's just a giant mess overall. I gotta empower these blocks because naturally they're used in other endgame recipes. I need those empowered items so that I can make, well, you guessed it by now, the next set of items, specifically getting into Draconic Evolution. This is where things start to get truly insane. Nether star blocks and compressed lava crystals. Lava crystals require, well, lava and quartz, just like the other chow stuff from earlier, but this recipe is an absolute abomination. Just get one wyvern core. Yeah, I cannot do this legitimately. So once I have managed to make one wyvern core, I will have an infinite amount, as you can probably guess. I fully automated this process too, and I have ideas for how to fully automate the entire Draconic fusion setup, but it would just be way too much time to actually craft all this stuff. I want to finish up this run now. Another reason I'm glad I skipped a lot of this stuff is because, man, this ticking noise is annoying. Sure, you could use a muffler, but like, okay, I kind of forgot about that at the time. To actually use the final few tiers of miners, I have to build the large microverse projector. This thing is a nightmare because I didn't realize you needed 27 quantum compressors. Like, making one of these things is bad enough, but 27? Yeah, I won't be doing that. I have the rest of the resources to build this thing, that's not a problem. It's just those. Even though it's insanely painful to wait for all of these recipes to craft, I have to admit it's extremely satisfying, as it always will be, just requesting one thing and having all of the hundreds or thousands of components just be made. I love how it just works. With everything finally crafted, I'm able to make a tier 7 micro miner. Unfortunately, I require both recipes of the tier 7 because, well, they're used for the final endgame things I need, but I really do not feel like making another one of these because I think I need one of the last 2 tiers of compressor, and that was a nightmare to deal with. The first one gives me a ton of blocks of gold, silver, which is actually useless at this point, diamond, also kind of useless, as well as the gold. The main thing is platinum, which is pretty nice. More importantly, dragon hearts. Yes, that's going to be insanely important for the Draconic Evolution crafting and getting the last few miners that I need. The other recipe I can make with the tier 7 miner is Dragon Layer Data, which is going to be required in a recipe later on, so I might as well make it right now. Also, if I remember correctly, this is one of those Draconic Evolution recipes that takes like billions of RF or something like that. It's pretty ridiculous. I hooked this up to both my reactor and my turbine power plant. That's how much power this thing needs. It's gonna get a whole lot more insane later, but for now, I was able to make the tier 8 micro miner, and this will get me some stuff for the next tier. The big things to note are a ton of dragon eggs, chaos shards, which are going to be quite important, some neutron dust, which is also insanely important, and a couple of other goodies that I'll need. To process the neutronium dust into nuggets, I need to throw it into a blast furnace, which first of all has to be the highest tier of power, and go figure, fusion coils. The funny thing is I actually have the resources and automation to create that blast furnace, so I'll go do that in a little bit. Naturally, to save time, I've given myself a lot more of the resources now that I'm able to make them, because I need a ton of stuff like neutronium, chaos shards, a gravity star, which isn't actually that horrible, but it's another star with neutronium fluid, so yeah, it does kind of suck. Thankfully, you get one from that mining mission, but you need multiple, especially if you're crafting this legitimately, and this recipe is also going to take a ton of power. Yep, this is the fun of endgame. Everything's just going to take hours to do. After automating some more assembly lines, I managed to get myself the Tier 9 micro miner. Yeah, this one took a very long time. The first recipe gives you a ton of neutronium, but the second one is what I need for the next tier. They both require something called stellar creation data. Now, this is one of my biggest problems with the pack. It requires you to make, what is that, like a full stack of tier 2 microminers and send them on missions to all get stellar data. So you need all of those and tons of ultra dense hydrogen per mission, which these are 81. I honestly don't feel like doing the math, but that's a lot of hydrogen and a lot of machine processing time. So you can see why I'm skipping over it. Obviously, I can do all of this. I've had the capability for a while, but there's no way I'm doing that and wasting all of that time. In the background, I've also managed to completely automate solar panel production, all the way up to tier 8, which is what I need to make the Wyvern solar panels, and the Wyvern solar panels create the Draconium solar panels, or Awakened one, whatever, and then finally the Chaos solar panels, which, yeah, okay, we're not done yet. Then the Neutronium solar panels. The Infinity is the last one, but you don't need to make that. Well, you kind of do if you want to complete the pack, I guess, but I didn't need to make it. Besides the massive superconductor wires, all of the Chaos cores, and blocks of Omnium, yeah, it also requires like 1 billion RF of power or something like that. Go figure. To make the final tier 10, I was actually missing a couple of random Ender IO things. They were mostly for the Draconic Reactor, or whatever that thing is, which I don't need. I can make some of the parts for it. I really don't feel like doing everything though, so I'm skipping over those. Like you know by this point, I just want to finish up this pack. I'm so freaking close to being done with this project. And consider this, I haven't even started working on the video yet. That's gonna be several dozen more hours of work I have to do to complete this run, truly. And finally, it is crafting the tier 10 micro miner. This absolute abomination. And technically this doesn't even complete the pack. For me at least, it absolutely does, because there's no way I'm spending more time past this. This unlocks some insane capability. You can do some crazy stuff with this item, and I'll get to that in a bit. But look at that pure power cost. That is 6 billion energy units. 24 billion RF. That's gonna be fun to wait for. As a matter of fact, since I can't actually process that much energy at once, I had to pause and unpause the microburst projector with my hammer so that I could actually get this recipe to go decently. After a run that technically didn't even beat the game and has taken 320 hours, I have finally completed it for myself at the very least. The one and only item you get from the tier 10 microminer is a Heart of a Universe. This item, I questioned it at first because I couldn't understand it, but now I see how OP it is. The Heart of a Universe can be thrown into a fluid extractor to create liquid that lets you make a portable creative tank. Now here's the fascinating thing about the recipe. The recipe actually gives you 145 millibuckets when you only need 144 to actually craft a tank. This confused me at first until I realized it all. They're literally giving you the ability to make an infinite amount of creative tanks, which let you make an infinite amount of any single fluid or gas, because those are counted as fluid in here, in the game. Thus you win, but not entirely, because you still have to build like 1 trillion fluid solidifiers to automate all of the liquids to solids. It's a whole thing, but yes, that is how you truly beat the game. You automate everything. I'm getting tired at this point, if you couldn't tell. So overall, I think Nomifactory and kind of Omnifactory are fascinating mod packs. I almost view them as a slightly lighter version of Gregtech New Horizons, or whatever Gregtech pack you want to mention. It definitely has way less playtime, and I could have optimized my run infinitely better, but it was fun to play at the very least. Up until the end game, of course. I've never been a big fan of these insane, creative, build a trillion item types of end games, and that's why I'm interested to see like how I like Gregtech New Horizons, because I've been looking at all their end game stuff, and unlike most mod packs, it doesn't turn me away from it. I'm also interested to see how New Horizons, like the end game, actually works, especially considering I've been having so much fun with it, and I have almost like 900 hours in that pack at this point. Meanwhile, 320 in this one, and I'm burnt out already. That's just how games go sometimes. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and thank you very much for watching, as always. And a special thank you to all of my channel members. You guys are all awesome. I hope to see you all in the next video, and this is going to be Enzo from Lookintogaming, signing out.